The Sequoia had stood for 1900 years before the storm brought it down. Marcus Hale found it the morning after, hiking the southeast patrol route through a section of the park most of his colleagues had quietly stopped visiting. He'd been up before 4. The way he was always up before 4 in October when the storms came through and needed checking on, and he'd driven the 20 minutes from his cabin to the trailhead in the pre-dawn dark with the truck's heater running and the radio off. He didn't need the radio to know what the storm had done. He could see it in the way the light came through the trees as the sky lightened, the gaps that hadn't been there before, the altered angles of shade and sun on the trail, the way the forest rearranged itself when something large came down and changed what the canopy let through. He'd learned to read fallen things from a distance before he ever got close enough to see them directly. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The air smelled of broken wood, raw and pale green. The interior scent of something that had been sealed inside living tissue for centuries and was finally meeting open weather. The fallen giant stretched across the shallow ravine below, its crown buried somewhere deep in the understory on the far bank. Its massive root ball pulled clean from the earth and tilted at a sharp angle against the gray morning sky. The exposed roots spread 30 feet in every direction, a cathedral fan of tangled wood and black Sierra soil that still dripped with last night's rain. Water ran in thin copper lines down the underside of the root mass, pooling at the base of the excavation the tree had left behind. A crater-shaped depression 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, its bottom soft with mud and bark debris and the slow color of centuries. He stood at the edge of the bank with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at it without moving. 11 years in these mountains had given him a specific way of seeing fallen things. The way they altered the light, punched gaps in the canopy where the sky came through, and left behind wounds in the forest floor that took decades to heal. This tree would have been a sapling when the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. It had outlasted the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age and 3 separate wildfires that Marcus could document in the park's historical record. Whatever combination of forces had finally taken it down, the sustained winds that had come through after midnight, the root rot he'd flagged in his inspection 2 summers back, the slow geological tilting of the soil along the eastern ridge, had required the patience of something very close to geological time to accomplish what one October storm managed in a night. He was working out how to write it up in the incident log when he noticed something in the exposed depression that had no business being there. Marcus Hale had been the ranger assigned to Sector 7 of the Sequoia Kings Canyon backcountry for 11 years, and before him, his grandfather Roy Hale had walked these same trails for 23. Sector 7 covered 412 acres of old-growth forest along the park's eastern boundary, the highest concentration of mature giant sequoias outside the main corridor groves. No one disputed that the trees were extraordinary. What people had been disputing, with increasing force and institutional patience, was whether Marcus Hale was the right person to be watching over them, or whether anyone needed to watch over them at all. The budget review in Sacramento had flagged Sector 7 as redundant coverage 8 months ago. The regional director, a man named Calloway who'd spent most of his career in buildings that faced away from mountains, had submitted the recommendation in writing: consolidate the eastern boundary patrol into the main grid, redirect the funding to the western corridors where the visitor numbers justified it. Marcus had attended the public comment hearing and spoken for 8 minutes. He brought photographs and erosion data and a breakdown of the poaching pressure he'd documented on the eastern approach over 3 years. He'd made the case without drama. Calloway had thanked him for his time. The job posting for his position appeared on the Park Service internal board 3 weeks later. The notice cited budget constraints and organizational restructuring. It made no mention of Meridian Timber, the logging company that had been filing regulatory comments about the eastern boundary easement for the better part of 2 years, or of the fact that Calloway had attended a conference in Reno 6 months ago that Meridian had sponsored. Marcus knew about the conference because his colleague Dana Reyes had told him in the parking lot after a staff meeting, her voice low and careful in the way it always was when she was handing him information she couldn't afford to have traced back to her. Dana had been doing this work for 16 years. She understood the difference between what you knew and what you could prove, and she was careful to stay on the right side of that line. Marcus had written up the conflict of interest concern and submitted it to the district ethics office. He hadn't heard back. That was 4 months ago. Meridian Timber was not a small operation. They'd been logging the central Sierra Nevada range since the 1970s, and in the past decade they'd shifted their strategy from outright acquisition to what their regulatory filings called access rights clarification, a phrase that translated, in practice, to identifying boundary ambiguities in protected land and applying sustained legal and political pressure until someone in a position to clarify things did so in a way that benefited Meridian. Dana had explained the pattern to Marcus over a year ago, pulling up examples on her laptop in the station break room with the careful, methodical manner of someone who had spent a long time watching this happen to other sectors before it started happening to theirs. In 2 previous cases on the western edge of the park system, Meridian had used the same approach: regulatory comments, sponsored research, cultivated relationships with regional administrators, and in both cases the boundaries had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. What Meridian wanted from Sector 7's eastern boundary, specifically, Marcus had never been entirely certain. The timber value of old-growth Sequoia was legally negligible. You couldn't log them, and everyone knew it. But Meridian's regulatory filings kept citing something Dana called a historical access claim, language that referenced the boundary's original survey from the 1950s in ways that suggested they believed there was something about that survey worth contesting. Marcus had read the filings 3 times and found them opaque in the specific way legal documents are opaque when they're designed to obscure what they're actually claiming. He understood now, standing in the depression beside an open hatch, that the opacity might have been intentional. Since the ethics complaint, he'd been doing what he always did, showing up before dawn and patrolling his sector, writing his reports, photographing his trees, maintaining a detailed log of every irregular thing he observed in 412 acres of old-growth forest that certain people in Sacramento had already decided wasn't worth watching over. He did it because the trees didn't know about budget reviews and regulatory comments and the slow procedural erosion of the systems meant to protect them. They were there, as they'd been there for centuries, and someone needed to keep track of what was happening to them. His grandfather Roy had understood that in exactly the same way. Roy Hale had retired from Sector 7 in 1998, when Marcus was in college, and he'd lived out his remaining years in a small house in Fresno with a shelf above the fireplace that held exactly 3 photographs. One was of Roy's wife Helen, taken at their wedding in 1961. One was of Marcus's father as a young man standing at the edge of a mountain lake. The third was of a man Roy never talked about directly, a black and white print, edges softened with handling, showing a figure in work clothes standing beside a massive rock formation with one hand resting on the stone. Roy would look at that photograph, sometimes in a way that had no particular expression attached to it. Marcus had asked about it as a boy, the way children ask about things that adults handle with unusual care, and Roy had said it was his father, and then he'd changed the subject with the practiced ease of a man who had changed that subject many times over many years. Roy's father, Marcus's great-grandfather, had been a miner. That was the family history, assembled in fragments over the course of a childhood spent in and out of Roy's house during summers and holidays. A miner named Silas who'd worked the Sierra Nevada in the 1930s and disappeared sometime in the early 1940s, leaving Roy and his mother alone in Fresno. Roy never elaborated on what disappeared meant. Marcus had understood as a child that it was the kind of word that stood in for harder words, and he'd learned to leave it alone the way you leave a door alone that you've been shown isn't meant to open. Roy had become a park ranger instead of a miner. He'd spent his career watching the same mountains his father had worked, walking the same ground in a different capacity, keeping a different kind of record. Marcus had followed him into it without fully understanding why. Whether it was the work itself he'd been drawn to or the particular quality of unfinished business that Roy's silence about his father had left in the family's air like a smell nobody quite named. He'd never asked Roy directly. By the time Marcus was old enough to ask the real questions, Roy's memory had softened at the edges, and the answers wouldn't have been reliable anyway. Roy died in 2015. He left Marcus the shoebox of photographs and the old patrol logs from his 23 years in Sector 7. Marcus kept both. Silas Hale, a miner. The Sierra Nevada. That was all Marcus had ever known. He was 41 years old, and his life had a particular shape he'd stopped pretending was temporary. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, quietly, and without cruelty. His wife Diane had finally said what had been true for some time, that she'd married a man whose real home was 3 hours from the nearest city and whose phone went dead above 7,000 feet, and that she'd waited long enough to see if that changed. It hadn't. He didn't blame her. The mountains hadn't been fair to her, and he'd known it and chosen them anyway. That was a kind of answer he'd had to sit with. His sister Anna lived in Fresno, 20 minutes from where Roy had spent his last years, and she'd been managing a kidney condition for 18 months that kept her in the specialist's office on a schedule that consumed money the way a slow leak consumes a tank steadily, without drama, until the gauge drops and the damage becomes visible. Marcus sent her what he could each month. It wasn't enough. It was rarely enough, and it was getting less enough as the specialist visits grew more frequent. The job posting on the internal board represented something more immediate than a career. Position was eliminated. He lost not just the work, but the salary that was currently the thinnest possible floor under his sister's situation. He'd been thinking about all of this on the trail, going in circles he'd learned to recognize as the kind that led nowhere, when the fallen Sequoia pulled his attention completely and everything else emptied out. He scrambled down the bank of the ravine to the base of the root ball. Up close, the root system was extraordinary, even by Sequoia standards, cables of old wood as thick as his thigh, trailing long curtains of soil and stone, laced through with smaller roots that had been feeding this tree quietly since before any nation Marcus had ever lived in was a concept someone had thought of. The root ball itself stood 12 feet high on its edge, and the depression it had left behind was genuinely profound, the shape of an absence that something enormous had occupied for a very long time. He was scanning the layers of exposed soil, reading the stratigraphy the way Roy had taught him to as a teenager, when he saw the hatch. Set in the wall of the depression, approximately 4 feet below the original ground surface, was a circular steel plate roughly 3 feet in diameter. It had a recessed pull handle and a concrete collar that had been poured carefully around its edges to seal it to the surrounding earth. The concrete was old, cracked in places, dark with long exposure to moisture, patched at some point along the way. The steel itself was heavy gauge, the kind that implied serious intention rather than temporary installation, and whatever coating had been applied to it at some point had held well enough that no significant rusting had penetrated to the plate's core. It sat in the wall of the exposed crater like something that had been waiting, patient and sealed, for whatever specific circumstance would finally bring it into the open. Marcus stood very still and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without moving closer. The forest around him was quiet in the way forests are quiet in the hours after storms, everything listening to see what shifts next. A woodpecker worked somewhere in the middle distance. Rain dripped from the lower canopy in erratic drops that disturbed the surface of the pooled water at the bottom of the depression. The hatch did nothing. It just sat there in its concrete collar, patient and sealed and entirely out of place in the raw geology of an exposed mountain root system. He pulled out his phone and took 3 photographs from where he stood, getting clear angles on the concrete collar, the handle, the surrounding soil layers. Then he climbed down into the depression. The ground at the bottom was soft mud and bark debris mixed with the organic material of centuries of accumulated forest floor, and it pulled at his boots as he crossed to the hatch. He crouched in front of it and studied the concrete work carefully. Whoever had done this pour had been deliberate about it. They'd smoothed the seam where concrete met steel with skill, then come back and filled the shrinkage cracks with a second application. The collar extended about 8 inches above the soil line, which meant the installation had been done before the Sequoia's root system had grown across and over it. He did a rough calculation in his head. If this tree was 1,900 years old and the roots had fully grown over the site, the installation could have been done any time from roughly the 1920s onward, when the tree's root mass was already well established at this depth, without significantly disturbing it. He pressed his palm flat against the steel plate. Cold, faintly damp on the surface. No vibration, no air movement. Nothing suggesting the space below was communicating with the world above. Just the passive resistance of metal that had been sitting in one position for a long time and saw no reason to announce itself. He should have called it in. Any structural feature, any artifact, or installation in a designated wilderness area required an incident report before personal investigation. That was standing protocol, and Marcus had spent 11 years following protocol because he understood why it existed, and because breaking it without reason was how people got things wrong. He unclipped his radio and held it. Then he thought about Calloway's office. He thought about Meridian Timber's regulatory filings on the eastern boundary easement. He thought about the sponsored conference in Reno and the ethics complaint that had gone unanswered for 4 months. Whatever was below this hatch, whatever had been sealed here long enough for a 20-century-old tree's root system to grow over it, was going to become someone else's business the moment he keyed his radio. And someone else's business, in this specific institutional context, meant Calloway's office. Calloway's office had a relationship with a logging company that had been working to strip this sector of its protected status for 2 years. He clipped the radio back to his belt. He pulled on his gloves. He took a photograph of the hatch from 3 feet, then from 1. He took a photograph of the serial number stamped into the steel near the handle's recess. He photographed the concrete collar from both sides. He was going to document everything, and he was not going to disturb anything he didn't need to. And he was going to look first and decide what to report and to whom, and in what order only after he understood what he was dealing with. The handle was spring-loaded, recessed flush against the plate. He worked his fingers under the lip, feeling the mechanism, and pulled upward. The handle swung up and locked. He gripped it with both hands and pulled. Nothing. The plate had no interest in moving. He repositioned, getting his legs under him, using the leverage of his back and thighs rather than just his arms. He pulled steadily, increasing pressure rather than jerking. For a full 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then something gave, not the hatch itself, but the gasket seal around its edge, a rubber compression seal that had been doing its job for decades, finally releasing its grip under sustained force, and the plate came up with a sound like a slow exhalation, deep and pressurized, followed immediately by a draft of cold air rising from the space below. Marcus sat back on his heels and held still. The air coming up from the shaft was cold in a way that went beyond the ambient temperature of the mountain morning. It was the cold of sealed space, dry and still, and carrying none of the organic smell of living soil. The closest thing he could compare it to was the air inside old stone buildings, the kind that had been kept closed for seasons at a time. The smell was mineral and ancient and entirely without moisture, which meant wherever the space connected to, it was either far enough from the water table to stay dry, or it had been sealed well enough to keep water out for a long time. He pointed his flashlight down. The shaft was lined with concrete block, carefully laid. A steel ladder with rungs set into the block on one side descended into the dark below. His flashlight beam reached about 15 feet before the shaft curved slightly, and the angle was lost. He leaned in and looked as far down as he could, listening. Nothing moved below. No drip of water, no sound of settling stone, nothing suggesting the space was live or occupied or in any way dangerous in an immediate sense. He checked the top rung. It was flecked with surface rust, but the bolt mounting was solid. He could see it was set with expansion anchors driven into the concrete block, the kind of installation done by someone who intended the ladder to be used repeatedly and safely. He put his weight on the first rung. No flex, no movement. He put his weight on the second. The same. He took a breath of the dry, cold air rising from below and descended. 12 rungs. Approximately 15 feet. The block-lined shaft gave way at the bottom to rough-cut granite, actual stone, hand-worked, the marks of steel tools still faintly visible in the grain of the rock. The shaft opened into a low horizontal passage, the ceiling clearing his head by perhaps 3 inches when he stood straight. The floor was compacted earth, dry as sawdust, undisturbed by anything he could see. The air at this level was colder than the shaft and completely still. He turned the flashlight down the passage and followed it. The passage ran 32 paces before it opened. He stepped through the entry and stopped. The chamber was larger than anything the passage had prepared him for. Roughly 20 feet wide and 15 deep, with a ceiling of granite blocks and heavy timber beams that had been placed with the care of someone who understood load distribution and wanted this space to outlast them. The walls were rough granite, dry, showing none of the seepage or mineral deposition that would indicate water infiltration. The timber beams showed no rot, no insect damage, nothing suggesting compromise. Whoever had built this room had built it to last, and it had. Marcus moved the flashlight beam slowly around the space, taking it all in before he moved. The walls on 3 sides were lined with shelves, heavy timber, braced against the stone with iron brackets that had surface rust but were structurally sound. The shelves held wooden crates arranged in rows, some stacked two deep, some standing alone. The crates were old, the wood darkened with age and the particular density that comes from decades of compression and cold. The hardware hinges, clasps, rope handles was tarnished but intact. Nothing had moved. Nothing had been disturbed. The arrangement had the quality of a room that had been deliberately organized and then sealed, every object in the position its owner had chosen for it. At the center of the room stood a wooden workbench, its legs set into the earthen floor with the permanence of something installed rather than placed. On the bench, a kerosene lantern, the fuel long since gone, the glass chimney intact and clear. A tin cup, a folded cloth that had stiffened with age to the texture of old leather. And at the center of the bench, positioned with the deliberate care of an object set down by someone who expected to return for it, was a journal, leather-bound, its cover plain and brown and dark at the edges. Marcus stood in the middle of the chamber and turned slowly, looking at everything, breathing the cold mineral air, and felt something he had not felt in quite some time. Not excitement, that word was too small and too unserious for what was pressing against his chest. Something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of an understanding that was too large to take in all at once. He crossed to the nearest row of crates and studied them without touching. Pine construction, dovetailed corners, fitted lids secured with wire clasps. No markings on most of them. He worked along the row, flashlight moving across each one in sequence. At the end of the row was a larger crate, broader, with rope handles on the sides, and burned into the wood on its face was a series of marks and a date. He walked the perimeter of the room, counting. He counted the crates twice to make sure. 27 in total, distributed across 3 shelving runs, ranging in size from the small clasped ones to the larger dated one. Whatever they held, they'd been packed carefully and stored with the expectation of retrieval. He came back to the center of the room and stood in front of the workbench. The journal sat where it had sat for decades, at the center, waiting. He looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then he crossed to the nearest small crate and worked the wire clasp with careful fingers. The lid lifted with the soft resistance of old wood that had settled into its closed position for a very long time. He moved the flashlight beam inside. The crate was packed with burlap cloth, brown with age, wrapped around a central object in careful layers. He lifted the outer edge of the burlap and folded it back, his movements slow and precise. His flashlight hit metal, dense, warm yellow metal that caught the beam and returned it with the specific depth and richness that distinguishes actual gold from every substance that merely resembles it from a distance. He was looking at bars, 2 of them, side by side, each one roughly the dimensions of a thick hardback book. Each bar was stamped on its face with a serial number and a year. Marcus put his hand on the nearest bar and held it there. The metal was cold and heavy in a way that felt almost geological, the compressed weight of something reduced to its densest form. He picked it up. It was heavier than he'd braced for. Not because he didn't know what gold weighed. He knew what gold weighed. It was heavy because the act of picking it up made real something that his brain had been processing as abstract for the 30 seconds since he'd pulled back the burlap. He was holding a gold bar in a sealed underground vault beneath a 2,000-year-old Sequoia tree in a section of national forest that a logging company had been quietly working to declassify for 2 years. He set the bar back down with care, replaced the burlap layers, and closed the lid. He stood up and looked at the 27 crates for a long moment. He was aware that his breathing had changed. He was aware that the cold air of the vault felt different against his face than it had when he'd first stepped in the same temperature, the same mineral stillness, but carrying a different weight now. The crates were no longer a collection of old boxes on shelves in a sealed underground room. They were the physical record of 7 years of a man's labor, converted into the densest possible form and buried in the dark for safekeeping. He opened 2 more crates. Both held the same contents, 2 bars each, wrapped in burlap, dated. One read 1935, one read 1937. He photographed both before reclusing. He did not open any more. He did not need to know the exact count tonight, and he did not want to disturb the arrangement more than he already had. Whatever was in the other crates would still be there. Whatever had been sealed in this room for 83 years was not going anywhere before Marcus figured out what he was looking at and what he intended to do about it. He took photographs of every crate, faced the wire clasps, the rope handles, the date burned into the large crate at the end of the row. He photographed the shelving from the entry point, showing the room's full depth. He photographed the ceiling beams, the floor, the passage entrance. He was building a record, the way his grandfather Roy had built records, the way Silas had built records in the journal on the workbench. Then he walked to the far end of the room. Along the back wall, partially obscured by the last shelf unit, was a recess cut directly into the granite, a natural fissure that had been widened and shaped with tools, roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. It was covered with a piece of canvas that had been folded and pressed against the rock, the fabric stiffened with age into something close to cardboard. He pulled the canvas back. Behind it was a shelf carved into the stone itself, and on the shelf sat a small collection of objects arranged with deliberate care. A rolled document, tied with linen twine that had gone stiff, a flat tin box with a hinged clasp, and a framed photograph, the glass intact, showing a man in work clothes standing in bright, direct sunlight beside a large granite formation. The man had one hand resting on the stone with the easy familiarity of someone who knew this particular rock in the way you know a place you've returned to many times. Marcus picked up the photograph and held his flashlight close to it. The man's face was partly in the shadow of a hat brim, but his posture, the way he stood with one knee slightly bent, his weight on his back foot, a quality of stillness in the way he occupied the frame triggered something in Marcus's memory with the force of recognition rather than discovery. He had seen this posture in photographs before, in a shoebox in his grandfather Roy's house in Fresno. In the photograph Roy kept on the shelf above the fireplace, the one he never explained. Marcus stood very still with the photograph in his hands. He set it back on the shelf exactly as he'd found it. He picked up the rolled document and examined it without untying the twine. The paper at the outer edge of the roll was stiff and deeply brown, but unbroken. Whoever had chosen this paper had chosen it for longevity. He could read partial text at the document's outer edge, where the roll ended. The words that were visible before the document curved away were Sierra Nevada Land Company and Land Patent, and the name Hale, Silas E. He held his flashlight as close as he could without disturbing the roll, trying to read every word visible at the edge. The partial text also showed what appeared to be a legal parcel description, coordinates and section markers, and a line of acreage that, as far as he could tell from the fragment, described several hundred acres of land on the eastern boundary of what was now the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, what was now Sector 7. He photographed the document's exposed edge from multiple angles, moving. Decades at the center, waiting. He looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then he crossed to the nearest small crate and worked the wire clasp with careful fingers. The lid lifted with the soft resistance of old wood that had settled into its closed position for a very long time. He moved the flashlight beam inside. The crate was packed with burlap cloth, brown with age, wrapped around a central object in careful layers. He lifted the outer edge of the burlap and folded it back, his movements slow and precise. His flashlight hit metal, dense, warm yellow metal that caught the beam and returned it with the specific depth and richness that distinguishes actual gold from every substance that merely resembles it from a distance. He was looking at bars, 2 of them, side by side, each one roughly the dimensions of a thick hardback book. Each bar was stamped on its face with a serial number and a year. Marcus put his hand on the nearest bar and held it there. The metal was cold and heavy in a way that felt almost geological, the compressed weight of something reduced to its densest form. He picked it up. It was heavier than he'd braced for. Not because he didn't know what gold weighed. He knew what gold weighed. It was heavy because the act of picking it up made real something that his brain had been processing as abstract for the 30 seconds since he'd pulled back the burlap. He was holding a gold bar in a sealed underground vault beneath a 2,000-year-old sequoia tree in a section of national forest that a logging company had been quietly working to declassify for 2 years. He set the bar back down with care, replaced the burlap layers, and closed the lid. He stood up and looked at the 27 crates for a long moment. He was aware that his breathing had changed. He was aware that the cold air of the vault felt different against his face than it had when he'd first stepped in the same temperature, the same mineral stillness, but carrying a different weight now. The crates were no longer a collection of old boxes on shelves in a sealed underground room. They were the physical record of 7 years of a man's labor, converted into the densest possible form and buried in the dark for safekeeping. He opened 2 more crates. Both held the same contents, 2 bars each, wrapped in burlap, dated. One read 1935, one read 1937. He photographed both before reclusing. He did not open any more. He did not need to know the exact count tonight, and he did not want to disturb the arrangement more than he already had. Whatever was in the other crates would still be there. Whatever had been sealed in this room for 83 years was not going anywhere before Marcus figured out what he was looking at and what he intended to do about it. He took photographs of every crate, faced the wire clasps, the rope handles, the date burned into the large crate at the end of the row. He photographed the shelving from the entry point, showing the room's full depth. He photographed the ceiling beams, the floor, the passage entrance. He was building a record, the way his grandfather Roy had built records, the way Silas had built records in the journal on the workbench. Then he walked to the far end of the room. Along the back wall, partially obscured by the last shelf unit, was a recess cut directly into the granite, a natural fissure that had been widened and shaped with tools, roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. It was covered with a piece of canvas that had been folded and pressed against the rock, the fabric stiffened with age into something close to cardboard. He pulled the canvas back. Behind it was a shelf carved into the stone itself, and on the shelf sat a small collection of objects arranged with deliberate care. A rolled document, tied with linen twine that had gone stiff, a flat tin box with a hinged clasp, and a framed photograph, the glass intact, showing a man in work clothes standing in bright, direct sunlight beside a large granite formation. The man had one hand resting on the stone with the easy familiarity of someone who knew this particular rock in the way you know a place you've returned to many times. Marcus picked up the photograph and held his flashlight close to it. The man's face was partly in the shadow of a hat brim, but his posture, the way he stood with one knee slightly bent, his weight on his back foot, a quality of stillness in the way he occupied the frame, triggered something in Marcus's memory with the force of recognition rather than discovery. He had seen this posture in photographs before, in a shoebox in his grandfather Roy's house in Fresno. In the photograph Roy kept on the shelf above the fireplace, the one he never explained. Marcus stood very still with the photograph in his hands. He set it back on the shelf exactly as he'd found it. He picked up the rolled document and examined it without untying the twine. The paper at the outer edge of the roll was stiff and deeply brown, but unbroken. Whoever had chosen this paper had chosen it for longevity. He could read partial text at the document's outer edge, where the roll ended. The words that were visible before the document curved away were Sierra Nevada Land Company and Land Patent, and the name Hale, Silas E. He held his flashlight as close as he could without disturbing the roll, trying to read every word visible at the edge. The partial text also showed what appeared to be a legal parcel description, coordinates and section markers, and a line of acreage that, as far as he could tell from the fragment, described several hundred acres of land on the eastern boundary of what was now the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, what was now Sector 7. He photographed the document's exposed edge from multiple angles, moving. Mother has kept him in Fresno where the air is better for his lungs. I send what I can. This work is not safe to bring a child into, and the company men have become less polite. Last month one of them came after dark. I won't write what was said. S. Hale. February 19, 1941. Land Office in Sacramento sent a notice about the patent. Said there was a transfer filing in November. I did not file any transfer. I have filed nothing since the original patent in 1936. Someone is using my name on Land Office documents. I went to Sacramento last week. The clerk said the paperwork looked regular. It was not regular. I am filing a challenge. S. Hale. Marcus's chest had gone tight 3 entries back and was getting tighter. He turned to the last written page. October 3, 1941. The challenge was denied. The clerk's supervisor said the transfer documents were in order and that my challenge lacked sufficient evidence of fraud. I know what that means. I know who it means. The patent is on paper in someone else's name now, but it was never legally transferred. I signed nothing. I filed nothing. I received no consideration, and there are no witnesses to any transaction because there was no transaction. The documents are forgeries. I cannot prove that in Sacramento, but I can protect what I built here, and I can leave what I built here for Roy when he is old enough to come back and find it. The land is his by blood and by law. whether the law acknowledges it or not. The bars are in the crates. The patent filing record is in the alcove with the other papers, the original, not the forged transfer. The vein is sealed. I have documented everything I can document. If Roy reads this, the mountain does not forget what was taken from it, and neither should you. If someone else reads this first, the patent belongs to the Hale family. What was stolen does not become property by the passage of time. Whatever comes next, I am done fighting in rooms that have already been bought. The truth is down here. The mountain keeps its own. S. Hale. October 3rd, 1941. Below the entry, in a different hand, older, the ink slightly different, the penmanship shakier, and written at some later date, were 3 words added at the bottom of the page. Roy never came. Marcus stood in the cold, in the dark for a long time without moving. The flashlight was steady in his hand. The walls were steady around him. Above him, 15 feet of granite and mountain and 2,000 years of fallen tree. And in his hands, the careful record of a man who had built something real and hidden it carefully and sealed his trust in it against the possibility of his own absence, and then disappeared, leaving a son in Fresno who grew up to be a forest ranger and walked these trails for 23 years and never once looked beneath the oldest trees on the eastern boundary. Roy never came. Not because Roy had chosen not to come. Because Roy had never known. Because Silas had sealed this vault in October 1941, and then Marcus didn't know what had happened next. He didn't know what disappeared meant in the context of his family's careful silence. He had always understood it to mean something ordinary. A man who left and didn't come back. A miner who moved on. The kind of absent father story that had too many versions to investigate. He was no longer certain it meant anything ordinary. He closed the journal carefully and set it back exactly where he'd found it. He photographed the last page, moving the flashlight slowly to capture every word, including the 3 words at the bottom that someone had added after. He photographed the first page. He photographed the open journal from above, showing the script and the date. Then he stood up, took a final slow look around the room, the shelves, the crates, the workbench, the alcove, and walked back through the passage to the ladder. He climbed up into the gray October morning. The light felt abrasive after the sealed dark below. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his eyes adjusting and his mind working in a way that felt less like thinking and more like watching something assemble itself without his help. 27 crates. Gold bars dated 1934 to 1938. A land patent filed by his great-grandfather Silas Hale on 412 acres in 1936. Evidence that the patent had been fraudulently transferred out of Silas's name in 1941. And a logging company that had been spending the past 2 years very quietly trying to acquire rights over the eastern boundary easement of what was currently Sector 7 of the Sequoia Kings Canyon backcountry. 412 acres. The same 412 acres that Marcus had been patrolling for 11 years. The same 412 acres that Calloway's office had classified as redundant coverage and posted for elimination. He reached down and pulled the hatch closed. The seal receded with the same slow exhalation as before, reversed. He brushed loose soil over the concrete collar until it looked like exposed earth among the rest of the exposed earth in the depression. He took a final photograph of the area, checked his GPS coordinates, and climbed back up the bank of the ravine. The fallen sequoia stretched across the ravine behind him, enormous and still, its great length disappearing into the understory. A tree that had kept this secret for 80 years, longer than his grandfather's entire life. A tree that had grown 30 feet tall, and then 60 feet, and then 100 while Silas Hale built the vault below its roots, and had gone on growing after Silas was gone, and had stood through Roy's entire career as a ranger, and had finally come down in one storm on a night when Marcus was the one on patrol and no one else was on this trail. He stood on the lip of the excavation and thought about probability for a moment, what it meant that the tree had stood for exactly as long as it needed to stand and come down at exactly the moment it had. He was not by nature a man who read significance into coincidence. 11 years of field work had given him a healthy skepticism about the stories people told to make events feel less random. Trees fell for geological reasons, not narrative ones. But the geological reasons had aligned in a specific way, on a specific night, to reveal something specific. And Marcus was the one who'd walked the trail before anyone else could see it. He was the one who knew what Sector 7 was, and what it meant to his family, and what forces had been working for 2 years to strip it of the protection that was, it now appeared, the only thing standing between 412 acres of patented Hale land and a logging company that had been circling it with the patience of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. 27 crates. Gold bars dated 1934 to 1938. He pulled out his phone and called Dana Reyes. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice had the cautious quality she used when she didn't know what she was walking into. "Marcus, you're out early. I need to talk to you," he said. "Not at the station. Not on the radio." A pause. That's specific. That's specific. A shorter pause. He could hear her breathing in the silence, calculating. Dana Reyes had been doing this work for 16 years, and she'd stayed employed by knowing when to ask questions and when to just respond to the information she was being given. "There's a diner in 3 Rivers," she said. "Off the main road, past the hardware store. I can be there at noon." "I'll be there." He put the phone away and started walking. The trail was familiar under his boots in the way things are familiar when you've walked them hundreds of times. The specific lean of the switchback at the first ridge, the place where the trail dipped close to the creek and the ground stayed soft even in dry months. The clearing at 4 miles where the view opened west toward the valley and the mountains dropped away into a distance so clear it looked invented. He'd walked this in every season, in fog and ice and the flat heat of August, and he'd never once thought about what was underneath the ground. He thought about it now. He thought about his grandfather Roy walking these same 6 miles for 23 years, watching the trees grow imperceptibly older, logging his observations in the same careful way Silas had logged the contents of the vault below. 2 Hale men, separated by 50 years and 1 layer of mountain, both keeping track of the same 400 acres of old-growth forest, both writing it down, one never knowing what the other had written. He thought about the shoebox in Roy's house in Fresno, the 3 photographs on the shelf above the fireplace, the particular silence Roy kept around the subject of his father. Marcus had always understood that silence as the ordinary grief of an abandoned child, the reasonable protective withdrawal of a man who'd taught himself not to expect things from a father who left and didn't come back. He understood it differently now, not as a man avoiding old pain, as a man who had never been given the information he needed to grieve properly, who had grown up carrying the absence of an explanation for the most important loss of his childhood, who had taken a job walking the same ground his father had walked without ever knowing why that ground had mattered so much, or what it had cost. Roy had spent 23 years as close to this vault as the length of a hiking trail. He'd retired in 1998. He died in 2015, in a house in Fresno with 3 photographs on the shelf. He'd never known. Marcus stopped walking for a moment. He stood on the trail in the October light and breathed, and tried to hold that fact without letting it break his concentration. Roy had never known. Silas had left the vault for his son, had written the instructions carefully and sealed them in the dark, and Roy had walked the ground for 23 years and never looked under it. Whether Silas had disappeared before he could tell Roy where to look, or whether something had prevented the information from ever reaching Roy, Marcus didn't know yet. He needed to know. Before he understood the full shape of what he was holding, he needed to understand what had happened to Silas Hale in the weeks and months after that final journal entry in October 1941. He thought about his sister Anna and the specialist bills and the posting on the internal board. He thought about Meridian Timber's regulatory filings and their specific language about historical access claims on the eastern boundary easement language he'd found opaque on 3 readings and now found perfectly transparent. They knew about the patent anomaly. They knew the 1936 filing existed. They'd been working the regulatory angle because they believed the land could eventually be reclassified if the protected status was stripped and the historical claim came back into play. They just didn't know that the original patent documentation was still here. They didn't know about the vault, or the journal, or the 27 crates of physical evidence that someone had taken this land without legal right. Or they hadn't known, until a storm came through last night and dropped a 2,000-year-old tree on the most important evidence in a century-old theft. The diner in 3 Rivers would have coffee and a corner table, and Dana Reyes, who had 16 years of institutional knowledge and the specific kind of careful intelligence that knew which questions were worth asking out loud. He had photographs on his phone. He had the journal's final entry memorized. He had the partial text of a land patent document in a sealed alcove, and a tin box he hadn't opened, and a photograph of a man who stood the same way his grandfather stood in the photograph on the shelf above the fireplace. He had 11 years of patrol logs. Every observation, every report, every photograph of the oldest trees on the eastern boundary, trees that had been growing here. When Silas Hale discovered what was underneath them and decided to protect it for the son, he was about to lose his ability to reach. He had the GPS coordinates of the hatch. He walked the last mile faster than he'd walked any of the others, his boots finding the trail without needing him to think about where to put them. The mountains did that for you after enough years took over the physical work of moving through them, so your mind could do something else. His mind was doing a great deal else. Behind him, the mountain kept its silence. Below the fallen Sequoia, in the cold, sealed dark of the granite vault, the journal sat on the workbench exactly where Silas Hale had set it down on an October morning 83 years ago, waiting, with the patience of something that had learned to measure time in centuries rather than years, for the hail that would finally come. It had taken 1900 years for the tree to fall. It had taken one October storm. And now Marcus Hale was walking out of the Sierra Nevada with his great-grandfather's voice on his phone, and 3 questions burning through everything else. What was in the tin box? What had happened to Silas after 1941? And what Meridian Timber would do when they found out that the ground they'd been quietly working to acquire had just opened up and shown someone exactly what it was worth. The diner in Three Rivers was the kind of place that hadn't updated its decor since the mid-1980s and had stopped apologizing for it sometime in the 1990s. Vinyl booths the color of dried mustard, a laminated menu with photographs of the food that looked nothing like the food, a counter where 2 men in work jackets sat, without speaking, and drank coffee that had been on the burner long enough to develop its own opinions. Marcus arrived at 11:40, 20 minutes early, and took the corner booth Dana had described. He ordered coffee and sat with his hands flat on the table and tried to organize what he was going to say. He hadn't slept. He'd driven back to his cabin from the trailhead in the low October light, sat at his kitchen table with his phone propped against a coffee mug, and gone through every photograph he'd taken in the vault. He'd gone through them twice, then a third time, and then he'd made a list on a legal pad, every item he'd photographed, every journal entry he'd read, every detail of the chamber's construction that might matter to someone who understood how these things worked legally. The list filled 2 pages. He'd stared at it for a long time, then put it in his jacket pocket. He'd also spent an hour online, searching land patent law in California and the specific legal history of the Forest Homestead Act and the Mineral Leasing Act and the various federal statutes that govern what happened when privately patented land ended up inside a later designated federal wilderness area. He was not a lawyer, and he was reading with the comprehension of someone who understood the stakes, but not the language. But one thing became clear even through the legal opacity. A valid pre-existing private land patent did not automatically extinguish when a federal boundary was drawn over it. It required specific legal process: purchase, condemnation, or voluntary transfer to move title from private to federal. If none of those processes had occurred, the private title was potentially still intact. Potentially. That word carried all the weight he couldn't yet put down. Dana arrived at 2 minutes past noon, slipping into the booth across from him with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to meetings that couldn't look like meetings. She was 53, lean, with close-cropped gray hair and a quality of composed attention in her face that Marcus had always found reassuring. She'd been in these mountains longer than he had, and she'd watched things happen to them that had made her careful in ways that went past professional caution. She looked at his face, and something in her expression shifted. "You found something," she said. "Not a question. I need to show you something first." He put his phone on the table and opened the photographs, sliding the screen toward her. "I'm going to start from the beginning, and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything." She looked at him steadily, then looked at the first photograph. The steel hatch in the wall of the excavation, its concrete collar visible against the raw soil. She didn't say anything. He swiped to the next image. The shaft, the ladder, the view down into the passage. The chamber, the rows of crates on the shelving. The workbench. When he got to the photographs of the gold bars, Dana put her hand over her mouth. He kept swiping. The alcove. The photograph of Silas Hale. The land patent documents' exposed edge. The journal's first page, then the last. He let her read the final entry twice, watching her face. She read it the way people read things that are rewriting something they thought they understood, not quickly, not performing reaction, but with the slow care of someone making sure the words mean what they appear to mean. She looked up. Silas Hale. My great-grandfather. Roy Hale's father. Your grandfather, Roy. She said it slowly, connecting the sequence. Who was the ranger in Sector 7 for 23 years. And never knew this was under his feet. Dana looked back at the screen. She scrolled slowly. Through the images, going back to the land patent text at the edge of the rolled document. She was quiet for long enough that the men at the counter finished their coffee and left, and the cook came out briefly to wipe down the far end of the counter and went back in. Meridian's regulatory filings, she said finally. The historical access claim language. That's what I need you to tell me about. She set the phone down. I pulled those filings 14 months ago when Callaway first started the redundancy review. There's a section that references a 1936 Sierra Nevada Land Company dispute over the eastern boundary parcel. I assumed it was a dead letter something from the pre-park era that had been legally extinguished when the boundary was established. It happens. Old claims, old disputes, historical record noise. She paused. I didn't look at it closely because it seemed irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. No. She sat back. If that patent was never legally transferred, if what Silas wrote in the journal is accurate, and the 1941 transfer was fraudulent, then the eastern boundary of Sector 7 was drawn over privately patented land without extinguishing the original claim, which means the land the Park Service has been administering as federal wilderness for 70 years was never legally federal wilderness. Another pause, which means you need a land attorney before you need anything else. Today, Marcus turned his coffee cup in his hands. There's something else. The way Silas wrote about the Sierra Nevada Land Company, they weren't just a company trying to buy his land. They were applying specific pressure, physical pressure, toward the end. And Silas disappears 6 weeks after his last journal entry. The official record calls it an accidental fall. Dana looked at him for a long moment without speaking. I know, he said. That's not something a land attorney handles. No. But it's something to understand before we decide how hard to push on the rest of it. She reached into her jacket and wrote a name and number on a paper napkin. Catherine Voss. She's in Fresno. She handles historical land disputes, and she has a background in federal property law. Don't call her from your station phone. Don't put any of this in your patrol log yet. Marcus took the napkin. And Callaway? Dana's expression went careful in the way it went careful when she was about to say something she couldn't take back. Callaway has been asking about your recent patrol activities. Nothing formal. He asked your sector's log coordinator what routes you'd been running this week. She held his gaze. He asked yesterday afternoon. The storm had come through the night before last. Someone had already flagged his patrol activity within 24 hours of the tree coming down. He folded the napkin and put it in his pocket beside the legal pad. Before he drove to Fresno, he went back to the vault. He'd been thinking about the tin box since the moment he'd photographed it and moved on, pulled forward by the journal and the gold and the urgency of the first discovery. But the tin box had been placed in that alcove with the same deliberate care as everything else Silas had left behind, and Marcus understood by now that Silas Hale had not been a man who placed things without reason. He descended the shaft in the early afternoon light, the October sun low enough that it threw long shadows across the depression where the Sequoia's root ball still stood at its tilted angle, patient and enormous. He'd brought a tool kit, this time a flat pry bar, gloves, his better flashlight. He moved through the passage quickly, past the point where the tunnel curved and the chamber opened ahead of him. Everything was as he'd left it. The crates undisturbed, the workbench clear, the journal precisely where it had been. He crossed to the alcove and pulled back the canvas. The tin box sat where he'd left it, the hinged clasp upright. He worked the clasp carefully. Age had stiffened the hinge but hadn't rusted it shut. The lid came up. Inside, packed against each other with the same burlap-in-care method as the gold bars, were 3 items. The first was a folded newspaper clipping, brittle at the folds but intact. He unfolded it with gloved fingers, holding it flat. The masthead read Visalia Delta, dated November 18, 1941. The headline on the clipped article read, Miner found dead on Eastern Sierra Slope, Coroner rules accidental fall. The article was 7 paragraphs. He photographed it before reading, then read. Silas Emmett Hale, 44, of no fixed address, had been found at the base of a granite outcropping in the Sierra Nevada foothills east of Visalia on November 12, 1941. The cause of death was ruled blunt trauma consistent with a fall from height. No foul play was suspected. The coroner's office noted that solo mining operations in remote terrain carried inherent risk. Hale was survived by a son, Roy, age 9, of Fresno. Marcus read the article twice. 6 weeks after Silas's final journal entry. 6 weeks after Silas had written that he was done fighting in rooms that had already been bought. He refolded the clipping and set it aside. The second item was a handwritten note on a torn piece of brown paper, the kind used for wrapping packages. The handwriting was not Silas's, it was hurried and cramped where Silas's was careful and deliberate. It read, "They know about the cabin. Don't go back. Someone from the company followed you from Sacramento. Get out of the mountains until this is settled. W. No surname. No date. No way to know whether Silas had received this warning in time or whether it had arrived the same week as the coroner's ruling." Marcus photographed both sides of the note. The third item was a letter, folded in thirds, unsealed, written on the same kind of plain paper Silas had used in the journal, in the same careful hand. Addressed, on the outside fold, in Silas's writing, "For Roy, when he's old enough." Marcus held the letter for a long time without opening it. He understood that he was holding something that had been written for his grandfather that had been sealed in this tin box, expecting Roy Hale to one day climb down this shaft, open this box, and read the words his father had left him. That Roy had never come. That the letter had waited 9 years, then 20, then 50, then more than 80, in a tin box in a sealed vault, while Roy grew up and married and worked these mountains and got old and died in a house in Fresno, not knowing any of this existed. He opened the letter. "Roy, if you're reading this, you found the vault. That means you're old enough to understand what I'm going to tell you, and I'm not there to tell you in person, which means things went the way I was afraid they might go. The land patent I filed in 1936 is real. The transfer you might have heard about, the one the land office in Sacramento says went through in November 1941, is fraudulent. I did not sign it. I did not agree to it. I received no money for it. Someone at the Sierra Nevada Land Company forged my name and paid someone in the county clerk's office to process it. I went to Sacramento to contest it and was told the paperwork was in order. It was not in order. The original patent documents are in this box with the note and this letter. They show my filing, my name, the correct parcel boundaries, and the date. These are the real papers. Whatever transfer documents exist in the county records are forgeries. A lawyer who knows land law should be able to prove this if you bring him the originals. The gold in the crates is yours. I worked that vein for 7 years, and I kept clean records. The assay records are in the journal. A lawyer can help you with the tax situation. I don't know exactly what the rules will be when you read this, but the gold was worked legally and stored legally, and it belongs to the Hale family. I want to tell you things a father is supposed to tell a son in person, over years, not in a letter that might sit in a box for God knows how long. I want to tell you that you have good instincts and you should trust them. That the mountains are honest in a way that people are not always honest, and that spending time in them will give you something that protects you from the dishonest parts of people. That your grandmother Helen was the best person I ever knew and you got her stubbornness, which will serve you better than any inheritance I can leave. I don't know what happened to me, if you're reading this. I hope it was natural. I don't think it will be. Fight for the land, Roy. Not because land is the most important thing. It isn't. Fight for it because someone took it from us, and taking things that don't belong to you is wrong, and wrong things don't stop being wrong just because they go unanswered for a long time. The mountain keeps its own. Your father, Silas Marcus, sat on the cold floor of the vault with the letter in his hands for a long time. The sound of the mountain above him was faint and steady, the particular silence of deep stone, cut occasionally by a far-off sound he couldn't identify, wind or water moving through granite in ways that had nothing to do with anything human. He sat and read the letter again, slowly, following each sentence to its end before moving to the next. His grandfather Roy had never read these words. The letter had waited 83 years for a Hale to open it, and the Hale who'd finally opened it was Roy's grandson, a man who'd been walking these mountains for 11 years without knowing he was walking over his own inheritance. He thought about Roy on the trail above, year after year, logging his observations in the careful ranger's shorthand. He thought about the 3 photographs on the shelf above the fireplace. He thought about the specific quality of the silence Roy kept around the subject of his father, not the silence of someone protecting themselves from grief, but the silence of someone who'd lived his entire life with a question he'd never been given the means to answer. He folded the letter and put it back in the tin box with the newspaper clipping and the note. He looked around the vault one more time. The room had been waiting for 83 years to tell this story to someone who could hear it. The gold bars, the careful shelving, the patent papers, the journal, all of it arranged by a man who'd understood that he might not be the one to see this through, but who had refused to let that stop him from leaving everything exactly right for whoever came next. There was nothing reckless about what Silas had built here. There was nothing of defeat in it. It was the work of a man who'd looked at what was being done to him and decided that the mountain would outlast it. He picked up the box and carried it with him out of the vault. He wasn't leaving it here. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Catherine Voss's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian building in downtown Fresno, the kind of office where the bookshelves were load-bearing and the certificates on the wall outnumbered the photographs. She was 58, brisk without being cold, with the quality of attention of someone who'd spent 30 years in courtrooms where details determined outcomes. She greeted Marcus and Dana without ceremony, gestured them to chairs across her desk, and said, "Dana told me the broad outline. Show me the photographs." Marcus handed her his phone. She went through the images in silence, her face still. She was not a person who performed reactions while processing information. She looked at the first photograph of the journal page, the one showing the first entry, and stopped. She read it. She looked at the final entry photograph and read it twice. She went back and forth between images for several minutes, occasionally zooming in on specific details with the practiced speed of someone examining documents for a living. When she set the phone down and looked at Marcus, her expression had the quality of someone who has looked at a great many situations in their career and is placing this one accurately in the range. "You have the original patent documents?" He put the tin box on her desk. She opened it with gloved hands. She produced from a desk drawer the automatic reflex of someone who handled historical documents regularly. She unfolded the patent papers with the same care Marcus had used in the vault. She read them slowly, turning pages, examining the stamps and signatures. "These are original filings," she said. "The paper, the stamp type, the ink consistent with 1930s county land office procedures. I'll need an authentication expert to confirm formally, but these look genuine." She set them flat on the desk. "And you said a fraudulent transfer document was filed in 1941. That's what Silas wrote in the journal. His challenge to the transfer was denied. The county records from 1941 would still exist in the state archive. If there's a recorded transfer on file, and we can show it was executed without Silas Hale's signature using a forensic document examiner and genealogical evidence, we have the foundation of a fraud claim." She paused. The statute of limitations on land fraud in California is complex, but there are established precedents for cases involving forgery of original title documents. The fraud doesn't expire simply because the fraudster is dead and the victim is dead. "What about the gold?" Catherine looked at her notes. 27 crates. 2 bars per crate, based on the 2 you opened. Approximate weight per bar? She looked at him. About 12 kilograms each. Maybe a bit more. She did the calculation on a notepad without a calculator, the automatic arithmetic of someone accustomed to large numbers. Roughly 650 kilograms per crate pair, call it 1,300 kilograms total, or approximately 2,900 pounds of gold. At current spot prices, that's in the range of $90 to $100 million. She said it the way she'd said everything factually, without drama. The number landed on Marcus's chest with a weight that matched what he'd felt holding the first bar. He held the number at arm's length for a moment, examining it from a distance before letting it come closer. "I underestimated the bar weight. We'll have a formal assay done before any figure is used in proceedings. The bars may not all be identical in weight or purity, but we're working with a significant floor number regardless of the variance." She looked at him steadily. "Gold found in a structure on privately owned land, if the land claim is validated, belongs to the landowner under California property law. There are estate processing considerations, capital gains obligations, and we'll want a tax specialist involved from the beginning. But structurally, the gold is yours. He sat with that for a moment. What's the land worth? 412 acres of old-growth Sierra Nevada with established mineral rights and documented timber value. She exhaled slowly. The mineral vein Silas documented would need a geological assessment, and I can't give you a land appraisal without a formal process. But conservation easement value alone, what a land trust or federal entity would pay to acquire, it legitimately starts at $40 million and goes up depending on the mineral assessment. Combined with the gold, you're looking at a total estate potentially north of $150 million. She said that number with the same flatness as every other, and Marcus appreciated the steadiness of it, because the alternative, treating each figure as something astonishing, would have made it impossible to think clearly about what came next. But Marcus, the more immediate issue isn't the money. He waited. The more immediate issue is that Meridian Timber has been filing regulatory comments about this boundary for 2 years using language that suggests they know the 1936 patent dispute exists in the historical record. If they've been quietly building a case to contest the federal boundary, they may be further along than you realize. She looked at him steadily. How much time do you have before Callaway moves forward with whatever he's planning? Dana thinks he's already started the process. Then we file first. Emergency motion to preserve the vault site under California historical preservation statutes while the land claim is under review. That gets us a legal hold that prevents anyone from accessing or disturbing the site without court approval. She picked up her pen. And we submit the original patent documents to the state archive for authentication before anyone can contest their chain of custody. Marcus nodded. One more thing. Catherine's voice hadn't changed. The letter from your great-grandfather. The one addressed to Roy. That's personal property with no bearing on the legal case. But I want you to understand what it represents in terms of lineage documentation. If we need to establish that you are a direct Hale descendant with standing to bring this claim, that letter combined with birth records establishes continuity. He thought about Roy reading those words. About the 83 years the letter had waited. I understand, he said. He drove back to the mountains in the last of the afternoon light with Catherine. Voss's direct line in his phone and a filing deadline of 72 hours. Dana rode with him as far as the park boundary, then turned off toward her own station. They didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't be better said after the filings were in. 2 days after the meeting in Fresno, Marcus walked the southeast route again on the first clear morning since the storm. He approached the Sequoia's depression from the east, the way he'd come the first morning, and stopped before he reached the bank. There were boot prints in the mud at the top of the slope. Not his own. His prints were a size 11 Danner boot with the specific tread pattern he'd been wearing for 2 seasons, and he recognized those in the soil automatically. These were different, a broader toe box, a shallower tread, the weight distribution of someone heavier than Marcus. 2 sets, slightly overlapping, indicating 2 people had stood here. They had stood here recently enough that the soil was still soft at the edges of the impressions rather than dried by sun or wind. He photographed the prints before moving closer. He photographed his own boot beside them for scale comparison. He got on one knee to check the depth of the impressions, which told him something about the body weight of the people who'd left them. Heavy, both of them. Men, probably, from the size, though the broader toe box could indicate certain work boots worn by anyone. He moved down the bank slowly, following the prints. They led directly to the hatch, the same path Marcus had taken on his own first descent, straight down the bank, across the muddy floor of the depression, to the concrete collar. Someone had crouched at the collar. He could see the knee impressions in the soft soil, the way the earth at the edge had been compressed. He crouched himself and looked at the hatch handle's recess. The small deposit of grit he'd noted on his first visit and left deliberately in place, a trace indicator of undisturbed condition, had been cleared. Someone had put their fingers in the handle recess and tested it with intention. He checked the seal. Still closed, still seated. They'd tested and found the mechanism, but the gasket had held against a simple pull without the specific technique Marcus had used. Either they'd decided against forcing it with the tools they had, or they'd been interrupted, or they'd decided to survey and return better prepared. He stood up and photographed everything with methodical care. The boot prints at the top of the bank, the path they'd taken down, the knee impressions at the collar. the cleared handle recess, the seal's intact state. He photographed his own prints for size comparison in every relevant location. He took wide shots showing the relationship between the prints and the hatch and the root ball, establishing a clear visual record of the spatial context. He called Catherine Voss from the trail, walking back toward the station. "Someone's been at the site," he said. A brief silence. Within the last 48 hours. 2 people, based on the prints. They tested the hatch, but didn't open it. Which means they likely knew about the hatch before your discovery. Either they've been watching this site for longer than we realized, or they were following your movements closely enough after the storm to know you'd found something. Her voice was measured and precise. "This accelerates our timeline. I'm filing the preservation motion today, not tomorrow. And Marcus, don't go below again until we have the legal hold in place. Whatever's in that vault has waited 80 years. It can wait another week." He didn't tell her the tin box was already in his cabin. 2 hours later, Calloway's office called the station. The secretary asked Marcus to come in the following morning for what she described as a routine administrative meeting. Routine administrative meetings were not scheduled with 3 words of notice by the regional director's office. Marcus said he'd be there and called Catherine immediately after hanging up. She told him to record the meeting if California law permitted it, which it did with one-party consent, and to say as little as possible. "You're not obligated to explain yourself in an administrative review," she said. "Answer factual questions about your patrol activities. If they raise the vault or the site specifically, tell them you have legal counsel, and any site-related questions should be directed to me." Calloway's office was in the regional headquarters building in Visalia, a newer structure that looked designed to intimidate people who spent their working lives outdoors. Glass and metal, and an atrium full of plants that had never been near soil that held actual history. Marcus waited in the reception area for 12 minutes past his appointment time, which he recognized as a power move and chose to find instructive rather than irritating. He used the 12 minutes to review the recording setting on his phone and to look out the window at the San Joaquin Valley spread flat and golden under the October haze, the mountains visible as a blue-gray wall on the eastern horizon. His mountains. His sector. His family's land. Calloway was a man in his late 50s who looked assembled from the generic parts of mid-level management reading glasses, a good watch, the specific posture of someone who'd learned to project authority in rooms that were already arranged to provide it. He had a woman from HR with him whose name Marcus didn't catch. They had coffee. They hadn't offered him any. "Marcus, thanks for coming in." The tone was warm in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "We've had some concerns flagged about your patrol activities this week, specifically around the downed tree event in Sector 7. The Sequoia." Marcus kept his voice level. "I documented it in the incident log. Filed the preliminary assessment on Wednesday." "Right. What I'm hearing is that you spent several hours at the site beyond what the initial assessment would require. And there are questions about whether you engaged in any unauthorized excavation around the root system." The word excavation was careful. It had been chosen. Whoever had briefed Calloway for this meeting had supplied that word specifically, and the word meant that someone had told Calloway more than they should have known from a preliminary patrol log. "The root ball displacement left a significant depression," Marcus said. "Standard practice is to assess for slope stability and drainage impact. That takes time when the feature is this size." "Of course." Calloway nodded as if this were reasonable, then moved sideways. "We're also reviewing your reporting timeline. Any structural feature or artifact in a wilderness designation requires a report within 24 hours under paragraph 14 of the incident protocol. Our records show you haven't filed a secondary report on the site." He watched Calloway deliver this with the smooth, patient confidence of someone who believed the argument was airtight and understood that from a narrow procedural standpoint, it almost was. A 24-hour reporting requirement on structural finds was real. Marcus had found something structural. He hadn't filed within 24 hours. The violation existed, technically, and Calloway knew it. What Calloway didn't know was that Marcus also knew why Calloway knew to ask about excavation in the first place. Marcus looked at Calloway across the desk. "I'll have my attorney contact your office about the site-related questions," he said. "She'll be in touch by end of day." Calloway's warmth didn't change. Neither did anything behind it. "Of course. We'll look forward to hearing from her." The meeting lasted 4 more minutes. Pleasantries about the patrol schedule, a vague reference to the ongoing redundancy review, the HR woman writing things on a notepad that Marcus suspected were mostly for the appearance of documentation. He thanked them both and left without shaking hands, walked to his truck in the parking lot, and sat for a moment with the engine running. He thought about Silas writing that he was done fighting in rooms that had already been bought. He drove back toward the mountains. Catherine's call to Calloway's office, combined with the preservation motion she filed that afternoon with the California State Historical Resources Commission, produced the particular institutional paralysis that legal filings are designed to produce. The formal investigation was not dropped, but it was paused pending clarification of the site's legal status. Calloway's office, whatever it had expected from an 11-year ranger facing job elimination, had not expected an attorney specializing in historical federal land disputes. Dana texted Marcus that evening. Calloway made 3 calls to Meridian Timber's regulatory office today. FYI. He texted back, noted. He thought about what those 3 calls meant. Not just that Calloway was communicating with Meridian. Marcus had assumed that connection for months. But that Calloway had needed to call 3 times in one afternoon, which suggested that something about Catherine's preservation filing had moved faster and harder than Meridian had anticipated. Either the scope of the claim surprised them, or the involvement of the Historical Resources Commission added a layer of scrutiny they hadn't planned for. 3 calls in one afternoon meant something had changed in the shape of the problem they were managing. In the quiet of his kitchen, with the October dark settled completely over the mountains, he spent 3 hours doing the work Catherine had asked of him. He scanned every page of every document in the tin box using his laptop camera, page by careful page, checking that the handwriting was legible and the stamps visible in each image. He photographed the exterior of the tin box and its clasp. He uploaded everything to Catherine's secure server and received an automated confirmation that the files had been received and timestamped. He went through all 22 journal photographs again, checking each page for legibility, making sure no entries had been cut off by angle or shadow on that first morning in the vault. They were all there. Every word Silas had written, from October 1934 to October 1941, preserved and timestamped and stored in a location that had nothing to do with the vault, nothing to do with the site, nothing that Meridian Timber or Calloway's office could reach. He drove to Porterville and deposited the tin box contents in the safety deposit box. He drove home through Mountain Dark and thought about Anna. He hadn't told her any of it yet. He'd been waiting until he had something with a legal foundation beneath it, something that wouldn't collapse under the first serious challenge. His sister was practical in the way people become practical when their lives run on tight margins, and raising something this large before it was real enough to defend felt like a kind of cruelty he wasn't willing to inflict. She'd been managing the specialist visits and the payment plans and the quiet mathematics of a situation that didn't have a clean ending, and she was managing it with a self-sufficiency that Marcus found both admirable and painful to witness from a distance. He sent what he could. It wasn't enough. He thought about what it would eventually mean to tell her. Not yet, but eventually. He fell asleep with the wood stove cooling and woke before dawn, the way he always did. The next morning, Jamie's research report arrived in his inbox. The Sierra Nevada Land Company, the entity that had contested Silas's 1936 patent and whose name appeared on the fraudulent 1941 transfer, had dissolved in 1955. Its remaining assets and any associated property claims had been transferred at that time to a holding company incorporated in Nevada called Pacific Ridge Holdings. Pacific Ridge Holdings had operated without much visible activity for several decades, no public filings, no litigation, no regulatory footprint until 1987, when it was acquired by a larger corporate entity as part of a timber and land portfolio purchase. The acquiring entity was Meridian Timber Corporation. Marcus read Jamie's summary at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading. He read it a second time, then called Catherine. They didn't stumble onto the patent dispute through historical research, he said when she answered. They own the fraudulent transfer. They bought the company that executed it. Yes. Catherine's voice was carefully measured, which means someone inside Meridian has known since at least 1987 that the eastern boundary of Sector 7 was built over a disputed patent. They didn't discover a vulnerability, they inherited it. And they've been waiting and working it slowly for 37 years. The number settled over Marcus like the cold air from the vault. 37 years. Meridian had known for longer than he'd been an adult. Their regulatory filings, their sponsored conferences, their patient cultivation of a regional director who kept his back to the mountains, none of it was opportunism. It was a plan, maintained through multiple corporate administrations, multiple regulatory cycles, multiple people who'd filed and signed and attended meetings while carrying the knowledge of a fraud that predated most of their careers. He thought about the men in Meridian's regulatory office who drafted those careful filings with their language about historical access claims and boundary clarification. Had they known exactly what they were obscuring? Had they sat in conference rooms discussing strategy while carrying the knowledge that the land they were working to acquire had been stolen from a man who died on a mountainside 6 weeks after writing about it in a journal? Or had the knowledge been diluted through 4 decades of corporate transmission until it was just a line item in an acquisition portfolio, a potential asset buried in due diligence documents that someone had noted and filed and never fully read? It didn't matter. Whether Meridian's current executives knew the full history or had inherited only the asset without its provenance, they'd taken the steps they'd taken. They'd cultivated Callaway. They'd filed the regulatory pressure. They'd sent 2 people to stand at a sealed hatch in the Sierra Nevada and test whether it would open. The budget review, he said. The redundancy classification. Part of a multi-step strategy to strip the site's protected status before moving on the boundary claim. Once Sector 7 was reclassified as unpatrolled land, the window to file the competing patent claim based on the fraudulent 1941 transfer they inherited would open. They'd have been first to the land office with a historical claim and no one withstanding to contest. It would have been watching closely enough to respond in time. They needed me gone first. They needed anyone gone who might notice. Your grandfather was there for 23 years and didn't know what was underground. They probably assumed the same was true of you. She paused. They couldn't have anticipated the storm, or that you'd go down the first morning. Marcus thought about the morning he'd found the hatch, the way he'd smelled the broken wood from a distance, the pull that had brought him down the bank of the ravine before he'd consciously decided to go. He thought about the fact that he'd been on that trail before any other ranger that morning, because he always went out before anyone else in October, because Roy had done it that way, because the mountains taught you to check early after storms. The mountain keeps its own. There's one more thing in Jamie's report, Catherine said. Pacific Ridge Holdings, in the period between its incorporation in 1955 and its acquisition by Meridian in 1987, had one active principal on record, a man named Harold Crane, listed as sole director from 1955 until his death in 1979. Harold Crane was a partner at a law firm in Sacramento that specialized in land transactions in the 1940s and 1950s. A pause. The same firm that handled land office filings in Sacramento during the period when the fraudulent transfer of Silas's patent was processed. The picture had been assembling itself in pieces. Now the last piece dropped into place. The lawyer who'd processed the fraudulent transfer had incorporated a holding company to preserve his claim on the stolen land. When he died in 1979, the company had sat dormant until a corporate buyer came along with enough resources and long-term ambition to recognize what it was worth. Meridian Timber had not inherited a historical anomaly. They'd inherited a deliberate, professionally executed theft, maintained in corporate form for 80 years, waiting for the moment when the original fraud could finally be converted into clean title. All of it resting on the assumption that Silas Hale's original patent documents were gone. All of it resting on the assumption that the mountain hadn't kept them. Marcus looked at the tin box on his kitchen counter. He thought about his sister Anna, in Fresno, going to her specialist appointments alone because Marcus was 3 hours away and the bills were piling up and neither of them was saying what they both knew about the direction the numbers were going. He thought about the job posting on the internal board and the 8 minutes he'd been given in a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner. He thought about $42 million in gold bars sitting in a vault in the cold granite dark, and 412 acres of old-growth Sierra Nevada mountain land, with its mineral rights intact, and a land attorney who'd told him the number started at $40 million and went up from there. He thought about a 9-year-old boy in Fresno who'd grown up to walk these trails for 23 years and never known what his father had left him. He thought about what fighting for the land had cost Silas. He thought about what not fighting for it would cost everyone who came next. Tell Jamie thank you, he said. I will. A pause. Marcus, "How are you holding up?" It was the first time she'd asked anything that wasn't strictly about the case, and the question caught him slightly off guard. He thought about it honestly. "I'm okay," he said. "I've been doing this long enough to know when something is worth the fight." "Good." The brisk quality came back into her voice, warm underneath it in a way it hadn't been before. "Because the fight is just starting." He was still thinking about that when his phone buzzed with a text from Dana. "Callaway made 3 calls to Meridian Timber's regulatory office today. FYI. He texted back, "Noted." In the quiet of his kitchen, with the October dark settling over the mountains outside his window, he spent 3 hours documenting every page of every document in the tin box, every photograph on his phone, every journal entry he'd photographed. He uploaded everything to Catherine's server. He drove to a bank in Porterville, 40 minutes away, and rented a safety deposit box under his own name with his own identification, a box that no one connected to his workplace would think to look for. He put the tin box contents inside it. He drove home in the dark with the mountains visible above the tree line and the cold stars of high altitude brilliant and patient in the October sky. He slept badly and woke early, the way he always did. The next morning, on a hunch that had been building since Catherine's phone call, he drove back to the vault site at first light. He told himself it was a patrol run. He drove the truck, parked a quarter-mile back, walked the rest, moving through forest that was gold and red with October in the narrow strips of early light coming through the canopy. He smelled something before he reached the bank, something that didn't belong in the cold mountain morning. Something chemical and faint, carried on the air from the direction of the depression, that his brain cataloged and classified in the half-second before he consciously registered what it was. Diesel. And the specific scent of recently disturbed earth, the wet clay smell of soil that had been turned over, different from the storm-fresh soil that had been sitting open since the root ball came up. This was soil that had been disturbed since the storm. He came over the bank carefully, staying low, using the root ball's bulk for cover until he could see the full depression. No one there. Quiet. The same October forest sounds, nothing that didn't belong. But the hatch was open. Not just tested this time, not the disturbed collar and cleared handle channel he'd photographed 2 days ago. Open. Pulled back fully and left that way. The handle locked in the upright position, the seal broken, the shaft uncovered and dark in the gray morning light. Cold air still rose from below, the mineral smell of the vault mixing with the diesel scent that lingered near the rim. They'd used a vehicle. Somewhere near enough to the site that the exhaust had drifted on the morning air, far enough away that it wasn't visible. Whatever they'd come to do, they'd come prepared. He pulled out his phone and photographed the open hatch before moving closer. The concrete collar showed new mark scuff patterns consistent with the tool being used to lever the hatch open. The same kind of marks that would be left by someone who hadn't known the gasket technique and had used a pry bar instead. They'd forced it rather than worked it. In a hurry, or not interested in being subtle. One of the two. He descended. He moved through the passage quickly, his boots on the compacted earth floor, the flashlight beam cutting ahead of him. The cold air intensified as the passage curved into the chamber. The chamber looked, at first, as it had before. The crates were there. All 27, still on their shelves, still closed, still arranged with the order Silas had given them. Whatever time constraints or logistical limits had governed the intrusion, moving 2,000+ pounds of gold bars without equipment wasn't on the agenda. The gold had been left. He swept the flashlight around the room more slowly. The shelving was undisturbed. The alcove at the back wall, he crossed to it and pulled back the canvas. The shelf was intact. The patent papers were at the safety deposit box in Porterville, but their absence here had already been the case since Marcus took the tin box on his second visit. The framed photograph of Silas was still on the shelf, the glass intact. They hadn't touched the alcove. Either they hadn't found it, or they hadn't needed what was in it. He turned back to the workbench. The workbench was bare, clear in the way it hadn't been before, in the way that was more than just emptiness. The journal was gone. The tin cup and the stiffened cloth were still there, untouched. The kerosene lantern, its glass chimney clouded with old deposit, still stood in its place. But the journal, Silas's journal, the physical document that had sat on that workbench since October 3rd, 1941, through every season of the 83 years after Silas had set it down, was gone. Marcus stood very still at the edge of the workbench and looked at the space where the journal had been. He'd known what they would take if they could take only one thing. He'd known it since the moment Catherine had said their fraudulent transfer claim would only hold up if Silas's contrary account didn't exist in written form. The gold bars were too heavy to move quickly. The patent papers were already gone from the alcove because Marcus had taken them. But the journal contained Silas's own record of everything. The mining operations, the patent filing, the contest, the fraudulent transfer, the final entry naming the fraud explicitly and leaving instructions for Roy. If Meridian's attorneys could argue that the journal's account was unverifiable because the document didn't exist, they could contest the patent claim without a contemporaneous written record from the patent holder himself. Except that they didn't know about the photographs. 22 photographs. Every journal page he'd captured on that first morning. Every word in sequence from the first entry to the last. The photographs of the alcove and its contents. The photographs of the gold bars. Every piece of evidence that the vault contained was now on a secure server with multiple copies, authenticated by Catherine's office and timestamped by the phone's metadata to the morning of the discovery. They'd taken the journal thinking they'd taken his evidence. They'd taken the journal and left him exactly where he needed to be. He climbed back out of the vault, pulled the hatch closed, and stood in the cold morning light with the diesel smell still faintly present in the air and the forest settling around him in its October silence. He looked at the open root ball of the fallen Sequoia, at the 1900-year wound in the earth that had started all of this. He thought about Silas sitting at the workbench and writing in the dark with his kerosene lantern and his careful hand, and about all the people who'd come after him who'd never known what he'd left. He thought about what it meant that Meridian had gone inside. Not just surveyed the hatch from the surface, gone inside, found the journal, taken it. They were no longer managing a regulatory process at a cautious distance. They were removing physical evidence from a site that was now under an active preservation filing. Whatever restraint or strategic patience had governed their approach for 37 years had broken under the pressure of Marcus's claim. That kind of pressure produced mistakes. He pulled out his phone and called Catherine Voss. She answered on the first ring. They went inside, he said. They took the journal. A breath. A beat of silence that carried the precise weight of a lawyer recalibrating. Then, do you have the photographs? Every page. Then they've made a serious mistake. Her voice had the quality of a door closing on something. Firm and final. Taking evidence from a site under an active preservation filing is a federal crime. Criminal destruction of evidence, obstruction of judicial proceedings, and if the value of the removed item crosses certain thresholds which an 83-year-old handwritten document in an active legal proceeding arguably would, we're looking at additional felony exposure. A pause. Marcus, this is no longer just a land claim. We need to involve law enforcement. He looked at the mountains above the tree line, at the pale October sky going gold at its eastern edge, at the forest that had kept its silence for 83 years and was now about to have nothing left to keep. I know, he said. I'm calling the FBI field office in Sacramento this morning. Historical document theft crossing federal land boundaries is their jurisdiction. And I'm filing an emergency injunction against Meridian Timber preventing any further access to the site pending criminal investigation. He listened to her run through the steps with the efficient precision of someone who'd been building toward this moment for 10 days, each piece of the legal structure clicking into place. He listened and he looked at the mountains and he thought about his grandfather walking these trails, and about Silas writing in the dark by lamplight, and about a letter addressed to a 9-year-old boy that had waited 8 decades for someone to finally open it. The mountain keeps its own. It had kept this for 83 years. Kept it through storms and fires and the slow institutional erosion of everything that was supposed to protect it. Kept it while one company after another waited for the right moment to take what wasn't theirs, and while 2 generations of Hale men walked the ground above without knowing what was underneath. Now Marcus was going to make sure that what it had kept would finally go to the right place. Special Agent Carmen Rodriguez drove up from Sacramento on a Thursday, arriving at Catherine Voss's office in Fresno with a colleague Marcus didn't catch the name of and a quality of unhurried precision that he'd come to associate, over the past week, with people who understood exactly what kind of case they were walking into. She was 46, compact, with the kind of measured attention that doesn't perform itself. She shook Marcus's hand, sat down, and said, "Walk me through the timeline from the beginning. Don't edit it for me. I'll tell you what's relevant." He walked her through it from the morning he'd found the hatch to the morning he'd found it open and the journal missing. He included the detail about not calling it in within 24 hours. He included the fact that he'd taken the tin box before the legal hold was filed. He left nothing out that he could see, because leaving things out for a federal agent was a different category of problem than anything else on the table. Rodriguez listened without interrupting and without writing anything down for the first 12 minutes. Then she opened her notebook and started writing. She asked precise questions, not about the gold or the dollar amounts, which she seemed to treat as incidental to the questions that actually interested her. She asked about the concrete collar who had laid it, what era the pour work was consistent with, whether the technique matched other structures Marcus had encountered in the region. She asked about the boot prints, whether he documented the depth differential between prints going down the bank and prints at the hatch, which would indicate whether the individuals had been carrying weight. She asked about the timing of Calloway's phone calls to Meridian relative to the meeting, wanting exact hours rather than approximations. The photographs, she said eventually. Every journal page. Time-stamped to the morning of discovery. On the server Catherine set up. I can pull them from any device. We'll need certified copies submitted through proper chain of custody for the criminal case. She looked at Catherine. Can you have that ready by Monday? Friday, Catherine said. Rodriguez nodded as if this were exactly what she'd expected. The forensic document team will want to examine the original patent papers from the safety deposit box. That process will take 3 to 6 weeks, but preliminary findings can be available in 10 days. And the journal? Marcus asked. If Meridian has it, they've already made their position worse. A removed document in an active federal preservation case is evidence of consciousness of guilt regardless of what the document says. Rodriguez's voice was level. We'll issue a preservation demand to Meridian's legal team today. Their response to that demand will tell us more than the document itself at this point. She left 2 hours later with a copy of the photographs on a certified drive and a list of 12 questions she'd be asking Meridian's corporate counsel. On her way out, she paused at the door and looked at Marcus. For what it's worth, in 20 years of these cases, I've rarely seen a discovery this well documented from day one. Whoever taught you to photograph your evidence did you a significant service. He thought about his grandfather Roy's patrol logs, the meticulous notation of everything observed, everything measured, everything changed. He thought about Silas's journal entries, each one dated and specific and faithful to what had actually been seen and done. It runs in the family, he said. The case number Rodriguez assigned it was a federal file, which meant Meridian's response would be measured, expensive, and carefully managed. 3 things happened in the first week after Rodriguez's visit. The first was that Meridian's corporate counsel sent a letter to Catherine's office describing the company's interest in the eastern boundary easement as a routine regulatory inquiry with no connection to any ongoing legal proceedings. The letter was politely worded and precisely evasive, and Catherine read it twice, and then set it on the corner of her desk in a way that suggested she found it useful rather than frustrating. This is what they say, she told Marcus, when they're deciding how large a problem they're looking at and haven't decided yet whether to fight or retreat. 2 days after the letter, Meridian filed a motion challenging the scope of the historical preservation hold. The motion cited procedural grounds and asked the court to narrow the site's protected status. The judge assigned to the case denied the motion within 48 hours. Catherine had anticipated the motion and filed a preemptive brief the day before it arrived. The second was that the California State Historical Resources Commission formally designated the vault site and its contents as a protected historical feature under the 1992 California Register of Historical Resources Act. The designation didn't resolve the ownership question that remained before the court, but it meant no one could access, disturb, or remove anything from the site without a court order. Meridian's people, whoever had been walking around that root ball in the mud with their broad-toed boots, now faced federal criminal exposure if they went back. The designation had been Catherine's idea, filed in parallel with the preservation motion, and it worked exactly as she'd intended, creating a second legal barrier independent of the patent claim, one that even a favorable ruling for Meridian on the civil side couldn't easily override. The third was that Calloway took personal leave from his position. The leave was announced as medical. The statement from the regional office said he would be stepping away for an indefinite period to address health concerns. No one who worked in the park system believed the medical framing, but belief was not the point of the statement. The point was to create distance between Callaway and the escalating federal investigation before anyone was asked formal questions on the record. Marcus read the announcement in the same parking lot where Dana had first told him about the Reno conference, and he stood there for a moment with the morning cold against his face, thinking about 8 months of watching his job posting sit on the internal board while Callaway managed the administrative process from the inside. Dana texted him. Finally, he texted back, yes. Callaway would enter a deferred prosecution agreement 6 months later, in March. The agreement required full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, restitution to the Park Service equal to 2 years of Marcus's salary for the period of Callaway's influence on the redundancy review, and a formal acknowledgement that became part of the public record. He had received compensation from a Meridian subsidiary while administering federal land decisions affecting Meridian's interests. It was not a satisfying document. The language was measured and procedural and didn't use words strong enough for what Callaway had participated in. Catherine told Marcus that deferred prosecution agreements rarely did. They were about outcomes, not characterization. The outcome was that Callaway was gone from the regional director position permanently. The redundancy review of Sector 7 was formally closed with a one-line notation that the sector had been reclassified as a priority conservation area following the identification of significant historical and geological features. Dana texted him the notation the afternoon it appeared in the administrative record. He read it twice and put his phone back in his jacket pocket and went out to walk the southeast route, because it was the right kind of morning for it. The formal vault assessment was scheduled 3 weeks after Rodriguez's visit, under court supervision, with a team that included a federal preservationist, a certified gold assayer, a geological surveyor, and Catherine Voss as Marcus's legal representative. Marcus was permitted to observe, but not to handle anything during the formal process. He stood at the entry to the passage and watched 7 people move through the vault with methodical efficiency that was, in its own way, an odd thing to witness after everything that had led to this moment. The space that had been sealed and silent for 83 years, that Marcus had stood in alone with a flashlight and the sound of his own breathing, was now lit by portable LED panels and occupied by professionals with equipment cases and documentation tablets. The crates were opened in sequence, each one photographed before and after, the burlap layers removed with the careful deliberateness of a medical procedure. Each bar was lifted, weighed on a portable scale, photographed from multiple angles, logged with its serial number and its 1930 stamp, and placed in a labeled evidence container. The assayer, a man named Thomas who had the comfortable physical authority of someone who spent his career doing precise work, paused over the first bar Marcus had opened and looked at the stamp for a long time. "You said you found this alone," he said. "Yes. And your first response was to put it back." "I photographed it first." Thomas looked at him with the considering expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. "Most people don't put it back. It took 9 hours across 2 days." The assayer's preliminary report, filed the following week, listed 53 bars of gold, averaging 11.8 kilograms each, with purity ratings between 900 and 925 fine gold. The bars were consistent in manufacture with commercial gold processing operations in California's Central Sierra Nevada region in the 1930s. The assayer noted that the quality of preservation was remarkable. The combination of dry cold air, stable temperature, and the absence of moisture infiltration had maintained the bars in near-original condition. He noted in his report that this level of preservation, in a structure built without specialized environmental control, represented an unusual and probably intentional choice of site. Silas Hale had known what the mountain's cold and dry stone would do, and he'd built accordingly. Total assessed value at current market rates, $107 million. Marcus read the number in Catherine's office on a gray November morning with rain coming off the Sierra and running down the office windows and sheets. He read it twice. Catherine watched him read it and waited, with the patience of someone who understood that very large numbers require a certain amount of time to become real. "The land," he said. "I was getting to that." She opened a second file. The Geological Survey team found the mineral vein Silas documented in the journal. Still intact, sealed exactly as he described. The entry point had been collapsed deliberately. From the look of it, Silas likely did it himself before sealing the vault, but the vein runs through accessible granite below the surface level. She turned a page in the file. The geological assessment puts the remaining extractable mineral content in the range of $30 to $50 million, depending on current commodity prices and extraction costs. That assessment doesn't include any potential secondary mineral deposits identified along the same geological shelf, which the survey team flagged as a separate line item. I don't want to mine it. Catherine didn't change expression. That's your choice to make, and it doesn't affect the assessed value for legal purposes. The land's conservation value, assessed independently by a certified appraiser, came in at $62 million for the 412 acres. That's the figure a federal land trust would pay to acquire it under willing seller, willing buyer terms. I'm not a willing seller. I know, but it establishes a floor. She looked at him evenly. Marcus, the combined valuation gold, mineral rights, land is approximately $200 million. Give or take the variables. That's a preliminary figure. It will be refined through the formal legal process. He looked at the rain on the windows for a while. $200 million. A number large enough that approaching it directly was impossible. You had to come at it sideways, in the specific terms it translated into. Anna's medical bills. Anna's specialist costs, indefinitely, without strain. A house she owned rather than rented. His cabin in the mountains, paid for, permanent. The patrol work, which he was going to keep doing because the trees didn't know about estate settlements and still needed someone watching over them. What do I need to do next, he said. Today? Nothing. I filed a formal adverse claim to the 1941 transfer document on Monday. She paused. Marcus, the case is strong. It was always strong once we had the photographs. What Meridian took from that vault was a physical object. What they couldn't take was the evidence of what it contained. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, and he appreciated the matter-of-factness. Drama would not have served the moment. The forensic document report, when it arrived in full, was 53 pages long and addressed exactly one question. Was the signature on the 1941 land transfer document genuinely produced by Silas Hale? The answer, supported by handwriting analysis, ink composition testing, and paper degradation patterns, was definitively no. The signature had been produced by a different hand attempting to replicate a signature the forger had seen in other documents. The attempt was skilled enough to pass a non-expert review in 1941, which was presumably why it had passed. It was not skilled enough to survive modern forensic analysis. Catherine filed the adverse claim the Monday after the report landed. Meridian's response took 4 days. Their legal team, a large firm out of San Francisco whose billing rates Marcus tried not to think about, filed a counter-motion challenging the authenticity of the photographs and arguing that photographs of a document could not serve as evidentiary substitutes for the document itself. The argument had a certain surface logic. Catherine demolished it in 9 pages that established, precedent by precedent, that digitally time-stamped photographic documentation created before a document's removal was established evidentiary procedure in both state and federal courts. The judge, a woman in her late 60s who had been hearing land disputes in the Central Valley for 21 years and had little patience for arguments that wasted her time, sided with Catherine in a ruling that was brief and direct. Meridian's countermotion was denied. The adverse claim proceeded. It was during the discovery phase of the adverse claim that the FBI's investigation produced its most significant finding. Rodriguez called Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon while he was on the Southeast Patrol route, walking the trail that had started all of this. He'd been out since 7. Moving at the pace he always moved on Tuesdays when the route was clear and the weather held. And he was passing the stand of cottonwoods near the Second Creek crossing when his phone buzzed in his jacket. "We found the journal," she said. He stopped walking. A pair of ravens lifted from a nearby branch, startled by the stillness of a man who had been in motion and suddenly wasn't. Where? In a storage unit in Fresno rented to a subsidiary of Meridian Timber under a corporate name. The unit also contained copies of Meridian's internal communications about the eastern boundary claim going back to 2019. Those communications include explicit references to the 1941 patent transfer and its known fraudulent origin. A pause, measured and deliberate. Meridian's senior vice president of land acquisitions was aware, as of 2019, that the transfer was forged. He proceeded with the regulatory strategy anyway. Marcus stood in the cottonwoods and listened to the creek below him and thought about a man in a corporate office in 2019, reviewing a historical file, reading about a 1941 forged patent transfer, and deciding to proceed with a regulatory campaign built on the foundation of that fraud. Deciding that 80 years was enough time for the original wrong to become invisible. Deciding that there was no one left who knew what had been taken, or what it was worth, or where to look for what Silas had hidden. The silence on the trail was the same silence it had always been. Wind in the high branches, distant water, the faint percussion of a woodpecker somewhere upslope. The mountains didn't know about any of it. They were just there, the way they'd always been there. That's not a civil matter, Marcus said. No, it isn't. Rodriguez's voice had the quality of someone who has been doing this work long enough to recognize the exact moment when a case crosses a threshold. We've identified 2 individuals at Meridian with direct knowledge of the fraud who continued to actively pursue the fraudulent claim. The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing charges. I expect indictments within 60 days. Marcus thanked her and put the phone in his jacket pocket and stood on the trail for a while. He was standing approximately 40 feet above the root ball of the fallen sequoia. He could see, through the gaps the fallen tree had left in the canopy, the particular slant of November light falling on the depression below the concrete collar of the hatch, just visible at the edge of the exposed root system, still and patient in the gray afternoon. He thought about Silas making the same walk, in reverse. Climbing out of the vault on a fall morning in 1941, pulling the hatch closed, walking back up the bank and away from the mountain, writing a last letter he never sent, dying 6 weeks later on a granite slope that the coroner had called an accident. The coroner's ruling from 1941 was not going to be revisited. Rodriguez had been direct about that when Marcus raised it. 83 years, no physical evidence, no surviving witnesses, no forensic possibility. Whatever had happened to Silas Hale on that slope in November 1941, the legal record would continue to describe it as an accident. The FBI's investigation was focused on the living and the crimes of the living, and that was where justice had a realistic chance of arriving. Marcus had accepted that. It was a different kind of hard thing to accept than the other hard things in this story, but he'd had time to sit with it, and he understood, by now, that what Silas would have wanted was not a reopened coroner's case, but a validated patent and a restored inheritance. That was what Silas had spent 7 years building toward, working alone in the cold dark below the oldest trees on his land. That was what was happening. He walked back to his truck in the November light and drove to Fresno to tell his sister. He'd been waiting for something solid enough to give her. What he had now: a federal investigation, a forensic report, an adverse claim in active proceedings, and a safe vault was as solid as it was going to get before the formal resolution. He drove the 3 hours from his cabin to Anna's apartment in the part of Fresno that sat between the medical district and the older residential neighborhoods, where the houses had small yards and the streets were quiet in the mid-afternoon. He'd called ahead. She'd said she'd have coffee ready. He drove with the radio off and the heater up and thought about how to start, and realized somewhere on the long straight stretch between Visalia and Fresno that there was no good way to start. There was just starting. She answered the door in the same kind of practical clothes she always wore: jeans, a sweater, the particular no-nonsense ease of a person who didn't use energy on appearances that didn't serve a purpose. She was 37, 2 years younger than Marcus, with Roy's coloring and their mother's directness. She looked at his face and said, "Okay, you're scaring me a little. Come in." He sat at her kitchen table, which was the same table that had been in their mother's kitchen when they were children, kept because it worked and because some things are worth keeping. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her own mug and looked at him with the patient attention of someone who has learned to wait for things that take time to arrive. He started at the beginning: the storm, the trail, the root ball and the depression, and the steel hatch in the wall of the exposed earth. Anna listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without performing attention, with a quality of stillness that had always made Marcus able to say difficult things to her more easily than he could say them to anyone else. She asked precise questions when he paused. How deep was the shaft? How old did the concrete look? How did you know what gold bars felt like? When he told her about the journal, about opening it to the first page, about reading the first entry, about the name at the bottom, her expression changed in a way that was different from how it had been changing through the rest of the story. She sat forward slightly. Her hands tightened around the mug. Hale, she said. Silas, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Roy never talked about him. I know. He had that photograph. The man at the rock. I used to look at it when I was little. She paused. I asked Roy about it once, when I was maybe 9 or 10. He said it was his father. Then he got up and went to the kitchen. I did too. He said the same thing and changed the subject. Roy spent 23 years walking that trail. Without knowing. She absorbed that. Outside, the Fresno afternoon was gray and mild, leaves moving in the neighbor's yard, nothing dramatic. Life going on at its ordinary pace while the two of them sat at their mother's kitchen table and reconstructed the shape of a history that had been missing pieces for as long as either of them could remember. He kept going. The tin box, the newspaper clipping, the warning note from whoever W had been. He watched Anna's face when he described the newspaper article, the 7 paragraphs, the language about accidental fall, the coroner's certainty that nothing was wrong. November 1941, she said. 6 weeks after the last journal entry. Yes. She said nothing more about that. But the silence, she held it and had a specific quality, and Marcus held it with her. He told her about the letter. He put the certified copy on the table between them, as he'd imagined doing for weeks now, and watched her pick it up and read it with the same stillness she'd brought to everything else. She read it twice. He could tell by the way her eyes moved quickly through the first time, then slower on the second, stopping at specific lines. She set it down carefully. He writes like someone who knows he won't get another chance, she said. Yes. He sounds like Roy. She looked at the copy of the letter, not at Marcus. The same plainness. The same not wasting words. Marcus hadn't thought of that before, and hearing it produced something in his chest that had no clear name, but sat there for a long moment before it settled. Roy had grown up without his father, raised by a mother in Fresno, and had still managed to become, somehow, the kind of man Silas had tried to describe in the letter. Good instincts. Stubborn. Honest in the mountains way. A man who spent 23 years watching over ground that had been his father's, without ever knowing why that ground felt like it mattered. Some things travel through families without anyone intending to transmit them. The medical bills, Marcus said. She looked up. Gone, he said. Whatever the formal resolution looks like, it's enough to cover everything. All of it. With real margin left. She looked at him with the measuring quality she brought to information that was too large to immediately verify. Marcus, I know how it sounds. It sounds like something I stopped letting myself think about. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that takes active maintenance. Is it real? Yes, he said. It's real. Catherine's confirmed it in writing. It's going through the legal process now, and the legal process takes time, but the number doesn't change. She put her hand over her mouth and looked at the window, and Marcus watched his sister allow something she'd been carefully not allowing for 18 months, a loosening of the specific tension that had been in her face every time he'd seen her for the past year and a half, sitting just behind her eyes in the place where people hold things they can't put down. He watched it let go. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour. The coffee went cold. Neither of them made more. They went through the details that could be gone through, the estate process timeline, the settlement framework, the legal hold on the land, and left the rest for when it was final. When he stood to leave, Anna stood too and put her arms around him the way she'd done when they were children, and something had happened that was too large for words. He held on. Silas left this for Roy, she said against his shoulder. Yes. And Roy never came. No. But we did. She stepped back and looked at him. Her eyes were clear. We're going to do something with it that he would have wanted. Yes, Marcus said. We are. He drove home through the November dark with the heater running and the radio off. The mountains invisible behind the overcast sky, but present the way they were always present, even when you couldn't see them. The case moved on the timeline Catherine had projected. The forensic authentication of the original patent documents was completed in December and confirmed their validity. The 1936 Hale land patent was a genuine, uncontested original filing that had never been legally extinguished. The 1941 transfer document was confirmed as a forgery. The county court hearing on the adverse claim was scheduled for February, but Meridian's legal team, facing a parallel federal criminal investigation and two executives who were cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for consideration, did not appear at the hearing with the confidence they'd started with. Meridian settled. The settlement negotiations took 6 weeks and were conducted through attorneys who communicated in the formal language of civil proceedings and said nothing to each other that wasn't designed for the record. Meridian opened with a figure that Catherine described as significant and a framework that required a mutual release of all claims. Marcus rejected it the first time Catherine presented it. "I don't want a payment and a release," he told her. "I want the patent validated and the land secured." Catherine looked at him with the expression of someone who finds a client's priorities clarifying rather than surprising. "You understand that a clean settlement is faster and removes any remaining technical risk on the patent claim." "What's the remaining technical risk?" "Low, based on the forensic report and the corporate chain we've established." She paused. "Not zero." "Then I'll take the not zero." She held his gaze for a moment. "The land means something to you that the settlement number doesn't." "My grandfather walked that patrol for 23 years. He didn't know what was under it, but he was there every morning. He chose those mountains the same way I chose them." Marcus looked at the window of her office. Silas didn't seal that vault so his family could accept a check from the company that robbed him. He sealed it so his family could have the land. She went back to the negotiating table. The terms Marcus agreed to, patent validation acknowledged by Meridian as part of the settlement, the fraudulent 1941 transfer formally voided, Marcus's title to the 412 acres confirmed in the county records, and a cash component of $14 million that covered legal fees and what Catherine described as adequate recognition of the harm caused by Meridian's conduct. Marcus let her define adequate. She was better at it than he was. The gold was a separate estate process. After taxes, estate processing, and the government's negotiated claim on the mineral vein, Marcus and Anna split a combined inheritance of $68 million. A number that translated, in practice, into Anna's medical bills gone, her specialist costs covered indefinitely, a house she owned, and a financial structure that a patient advisor put together over 3 meetings in early spring, practical and clear. Marcus kept his cabin. He kept his patrol route. He kept his job. The 2 Meridian executives who had known about the fraud, the vice president of land acquisitions, and a senior regulatory counsel who drafted the falsified compliance filings over a period of years, were indicted by a federal grand jury in April. The charges included wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the federal government. The indictments were a matter of public record, which meant the details of what Meridian had known and when and what they had done with that knowledge became, for a brief period, news. It was not the kind of news that lingered: a corporate land dispute, a fraud case, a federal proceeding that would take years to complete, but it lasted long enough for the story to surface in the regional papers and the industry publications that covered timber and land rights. The headline in one of the regional papers read, "Ranger uncovers century-old land fraud in Sierra Vault." The story got the basic facts right, but missed most of the human weight of it: the unsent letter, Roy's 23 years on the trail, what it meant that the tree had come down on the specific night and in the specific way it had. Human weight rarely makes it into headlines. Marcus read the article once and put it in a folder with the other legal documents and didn't read it again. His testimony preparation took 3 months of work with Catherine that was methodical and at times tedious, going through the same sequence of events in the same sequence until every answer was precise and every fact was documentable. He didn't mind the tedium. He'd been doing precise documentation for 11 years. The process was familiar, if not the subject matter. The one thing the legal process could not do, he'd understood from the beginning, was answer the question of what had happened to Silas Hale on a granite slope in November 1941. Rodriguez had been careful about this from the beginning and honest about the limits of what 83-year-old evidence could support. The coroner's ruling stood. Silas Hale's death remained accidental in the official record. But in January, Marcus filed a request with the Sierra County Historical Society to have Silas Hale included in a forthcoming exhibit on Sierra Nevada mining history. He sent them the journal photographs, the patent documents, the newspaper clipping, and a short written account of what had been found in the vault. The Historical Society's archivist, a woman named Patricia Osman, who had been cataloging Sierra mining history for 26 years, called him 3 days after receiving the materials. "This is extraordinary documentation," she said. "The journal alone is one of the most detailed accounts of independent Sierra mining operations from the 1930s we've ever encountered." A pause. "The circumstances of his death are noted in our records as being under investigation at the time of the documentation. We can note that his claims were subsequently validated and that significant questions remain about the events of November 1941. "That's enough," Marcus said. It was enough to have it noted. To have Silas's name attached to something other than a 7-line newspaper article about an accidental fall on a mountain slope. To have the record show that a man had been here, had built something real, had tried to protect it for the people who came after him, and had not failed even if it had taken 83 years for the not failing to become visible. Patricia Osman and her team included Silas Hale in the exhibit with a display that Marcus saw for the first time in February, when the museum opened the new Sierra mining history section to the public. A black-and-white reproduction of the journal's first page was mounted beside a framed copy of the 1936 land patent and the photograph from the alcove Silas at the rock, hand resting on the stone, face in shadow. The caption read, "Silas Emmett Hale, independent miner, 1890 to 1941. Patented 412 acres of Sierra Nevada land in 1936. His records, sealed in an underground vault for 83 years, were discovered by his great-grandson Marcus Hale in October 2023 following a storm that felled a 1,900-year-old Sequoia. Hale's patent was subsequently validated in state court after evidence confirmed the 1941 transfer of his claim to be fraudulent. Marcus stood in front of the display for a long time. He didn't feel the need to explain to anyone who he was. The museum was not crowded on a Tuesday in February, and the visitors who moved through the section paused at the display without knowing they were standing next to the man in the caption. He let them look. He listened to a child ask his father what a land patent was, and listened to the father explain it in approximate terms, and thought that approximately right was enough for a Tuesday in February and a 7-year-old's attention span. He walked back out into the gray February morning and drove toward the mountains. He visited the vault on the 1-year anniversary of the storm. He drove to the trailhead before dawn and hiked the southeast route in the dark with his headlamp and his good flashlight, the same one he'd used on the first morning. The air was cold in the specific way it was cold on the mornings after clear October nights, sharp and without moisture, the kind that made your exhaled breath visible from the first step out of the truck. The forest was dark in the pre-dawn, the trees shapeless above the narrow cone of the headlamp, the trail familiar enough beneath his boots that he didn't need to look at it. He knew this route in his body. He'd known it in his body for 11 years. He'd walked it in fog so dense he couldn't see the trees on either side, in ice that made every step a negotiation, in the flat heat of August when the air tasted of pine resin and the birds went silent by noon. He'd walked it the morning after storms, checking what had shifted, what had fallen, what had changed in the night. He'd walked it on the morning that changed everything. The forest was different in October of the second year the gap the fallen Sequoia had left in the canopy had opened a column of sky that was visible even now, in the dark, as a slightly different shade of darkness, a vertical absence where 1,900 years of tree had been. Frost crystals had formed on the exposed bark of the root ball, catching the headlamp's beam and scattering it. The depression was still there, smaller in impression than memory. The human mind expands significant places in its storage, and returning to them is always a calibration. He climbed down the bank and stood at the hatch. The court preservation order had formalized the access process. He had his permit. He had the key to the new padlock that had replaced Silas's original seal during the legal proceedings, a steel padlock that was the court's padlock, not anyone else's. He unlocked it and pulled the hatch. The exhalation of cold air came up the way it always had, dry and mineral and entirely itself. He descended into the vault. The legal process had changed the space in small ways. The LED panels gave it a different quality of light than the flashlight had given it on the first morning. The crates were labeled with court evidence tags, sealed and documented. The workbench had a clear evidence marker placed beside the journal. But the room itself was unchanged, the dry cold of it, the particular silence, the sense of a space that had been here long before any of the proceedings that were resolving around it. He crossed to the workbench and opened the journal. He read the first entry, then the last. He read several entries in between: the 1936 patent note, the 1939 note about the San Francisco lawyers, the August 1940 entry about Roy at 8 years old, his mother keeping him in Fresno where the air was better. The entry had a quality Marcus had noticed before and kept noticing. Silas wrote about Roy with the restraint of a man who was afraid that saying too much would be too painful to finish. He described Roy's age and his mother's decisions. He sent what he could. He hoped the boy was stubborn. He'd been right about the stubborn. Roy had been stubborn. Roy had walked these mountains for 23 years and refused to leave when easier options existed. And Marcus had done the same thing. And here they both were, Roy in memory, Marcus in the present, both of them in the same mountains, connected to the same ground by the same quality of refusal to let go of something that mattered even when the immediate reasons for holding on had become unclear. Marcus sat on the edge of the workbench for a while. He thought about what Silas had actually been asking for when he built this vault and sealed the journal and left the instructions for Roy. Not a miracle, not a guarantee. He'd been asking for time. Time for the truth to outlast the people who wanted it buried. Time for whatever came after him, a child, a grandchild, a generation further removed, to find the record and use it. He'd asked the mountain for that time, and the mountain had given it, in the form of a root system that grew over a concrete collar and kept it hidden for 8 decades. And then one storm on one night in October had changed the angle of a root ball that had been fixed for centuries, and a ranger had been on the trail early, the way rangers were trained to be early after storms, and the record had come back into the light. He closed the journal and left it on the workbench exactly where it belonged. He climbed back up into the October morning. The light was full and clear by the time he reached the surface, the kind of light that comes when a cold night gives way to a cloudless morning, turning the ridge gold from the east before it reaches the valley. He stood at the edge of the depression and looked at the fallen Sequoia, gray-silver now in its second year of beginning to return to the forest, the crown decaying slowly into the understory, the trunk still massive and present, but no longer the living entity it had been. In the cavity where the root ball had stood, small ferns had taken hold in the rich, exposed soil. The ospreys that had nested in the open canopy were gone for the winter, but would be back in spring. Life is not sentimental about the spaces loss creates. It moves into them and begins its work. Marcus looked at the mountains above the tree line. He looked at the 412 acres of old-growth forest that were, formally and legally and on the county record, Hale land. The same 412 acres Roy had walked. The same acres Silas had patented in 1936 and worked alone through the Depression years, converting a mountain's mineral wealth into gold bars by lamplight, keeping careful records, building something for the family he was already losing. He thought about what he'd do with it. The land question, beyond securing it, was still being considered. He'd talked to Catherine about a conservation agreement with a land trust that would legally prevent future development or extraction while keeping the Hale patent intact, a way of securing the land's protection in perpetuity without selling it. The conversation was ongoing. There was time. He was no longer operating from a position of a man with 8 months before his job disappeared. He thought about Dana, who had been watching his back through all of it with the patient care of someone who understood what was at stake and knew exactly what she could and couldn't afford to do. He'd written her a letter, formal and specific, for the ethics review of Calloway's conduct. He'd told her in person, in the parking lot of the station, in November, that she was the reason he'd gone to Catherine when he did, and that going to Catherine when he did was the reason the photographs existed before the journal was taken. She'd said, "You would have found another way." He'd said, "Maybe." They both knew it wasn't certain. He thought about his sister buying a house, choosing curtains and a kitchen table and a yard with enough space for the garden she'd been describing for years. Calling him on a Sunday afternoon to tell him there was a lemon tree in the backyard that had been there since the previous owners and was apparently enormous, and she didn't know what to do with the lemons. He'd told her to make lemonade. She'd said that was not helpful. He'd laughed, which was not something he'd done easily for the better part of 2 years, and she'd laughed too. And they'd talk for an hour about nothing in particular, the way they used to talk when they were kids, and the world had not yet made itself complicated. He thought about Silas. He thought about a man at 44 years old, which was 3 years older than Marcus was now, sitting at a workbench in the cold dark below the oldest trees, on his land, writing a letter to a son he'd had to keep at a distance because proximity felt dangerous and absence felt wrong, and there was no option that didn't cost something. Writing with care, because the handwriting was careful. Writing without drama, because the record was without drama. Saying what he meant and meaning what he said, and trusting the mountain to carry it forward. The mountain keeps its own. It had kept this. It had held it through everything the world had thrown at the eastern boundary of Sector 7, the surveys, and the filings, and the corporate acquisitions, and the regulatory comments, and the budget reviews, and Callaway's 3 phone calls to a logging company's regulatory office on a Thursday afternoon. It had held it until the right storm, and the right morning, and the right ranger on the right trail. Marcus walked back along the southeast route in the October light, the forest settling around him as it always settled after a cold night, everything adjusting to the morning. He checked in by radio at the ranger station before noon. "You're good, Hale," the dispatcher said. "Nothing to report." "Nothing to report," he confirmed. He walked the rest of the route with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the trees, the way he'd always walked it. 11 years of the same trail. 12 years now, counting this October. However many more it would be. The trees didn't know about patent validations or settlement agreements or federal indictments. They were just there, the way they'd been there for centuries, growing their slow, incremental growth toward light, putting their roots down into the soil of a mountain that had been keeping its secrets for longer than any human record could reach. They needed someone to watch over them and notice when things changed, and write it down and show up early after storms. That was the job. That had always been the job. Marcus Hale walked the southeast route of Sector 7 and did his job, the way his grandfather had done it, and the way his great-grandfather had walked this same ground before either of them. A man who'd understood that the most important thing you could do for the people who came after you was to leave the truth somewhere it could survive, and trust the mountain to keep it until they arrived. 1900 years for the tree to stand. One night for the storm to bring it down. One morning for a ranger to find what was underneath. Some things require patience on a geological scale. Some inheritances take 3 generations to arrive. And sometimes the moment that changes everything looks, from the outside, like nothing more than a man walking a familiar trail in the cold October, dark, no indication, no premonition, nothing to separate it from the 1,000 other mornings he's walked the same ground, and come home with nothing more than a patrol log and cold boots. The difference, on the morning that matters, is that you went out early, that you looked where you'd looked 100 times before, that you climbed down into the depression instead of photographing it from the bank and moving on, that you put your palm flat against a steel hatch in a wall of exposed earth and felt the cold of something that had been waiting a long time for the right hand to find it. Marcus climbed into his truck at the trailhead in the early afternoon, the mountains behind him holding their old silence. He drove back toward the cabin with the windows down despite the October cold, letting the mountain air run through the truck the way it ran through the forest, clean and uncompromised and entirely itself. The trees stood on either side of the road in their October colors, the aspens gold against the dark green of the sequoias, the sky above them a blue that only happened at elevation after a clear cold night. He thought about Silas one more time, briefly, before he turned onto the road that led to the cabin and the ordinary work of the afternoon. He thought about a man sitting in the dark with a lantern and a journal, writing the last thing he'd write in a life that had cost him more than it should have. Silas had not written with self-pity. He had not written with bitterness, or not much of it, just the controlled anger of a man who understood that what was being done to him was wrong and said so clearly, without performing the anger. He had written with the directness of someone who had things to say and a limited and uncertain amount of time to say them, and who chose, at the end, to spend that time on what mattered. The land, the record, the instruction to fight for it, the hope that Roy was stubborn. 3 generations later, at a kitchen table in Fresno in November, Anna had read the letter and said, "We're going to do something with it that he would have wanted." Yes, Marcus thought. They were. He parked at the cabin and walked inside and put the kettle on and sat at his own kitchen table with the last light of the October afternoon coming through the window, and thought about what it meant to finally be the person standing where the past had always been pointing. He thought about the photograph Roy had kept on the shelf above the fireplace. The man at the rock. He'd looked at it hundreds of times as a child and accepted it as the image of a family mystery too old to solve. He'd grown up to walk the same mountains the man in the photograph had walked, without knowing that was what he was doing. He'd spent 11 years patrolling the same 412 acres that Silas had patented, maintaining and documenting and protecting land that was, it turned out, already his by blood and law, and the particular stubbornness of a granite mountain that didn't let go of what it was holding. He'd found the hatch because he went out early after storms. Because Roy had taught him to. Because some things transmit through families in ways that don't require the knowledge of what's being transmitted, just the habit, just the practice, just the particular quality of attention that makes a person stop at the edge of a ravine and look at an impossible thing and climb down to get closer instead of photographing it from the bank and moving on. Somewhere in the months between the discovery and the settlement, a thought had lodged itself in Marcus that he kept returning to without quite being able to put it away. Roy had never known what was under the ground he walked, and yet Roy had stayed. He'd stayed for 23 years when it would have been easier to take a post somewhere flatter, somewhere closer to Fresno and his family, somewhere without the specific physical demands of high-altitude backcountry patrol. He'd stayed because the mountains held him, the way they'd held his father before him, the way they'd held Marcus after. Not because any of them knew why, just because the holding was real, and they were the kind of people who responded to real things with their presence. That was what Silas had hoped for. Not that Roy would find the vault on his first year, just that Roy would stay close enough to find it eventually, that the stubbornness would persist across generations, that the mountain would have time to do its work. The mountain had needed more time than Silas anticipated. 3 generations instead of 1. But the mountain was patient in ways that people rarely managed to be, and it had kept what it was holding until the right person arrived. Not luck, not fate, just the particular stubbornness of a family that had learned, across 3 generations of mountains, to show up early and stay late and trust the ground beneath their feet, even when they couldn't see what the ground was holding. The kettle whistled. He made his tea. He sat by the window until the light failed and the mountains went dark and the first stars came out above the ridge, cold and numerous and entirely indifferent to anything that had happened in the forest below them. They were still there. They'd be there tomorrow. So would Marcus Hale. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.